If Jeff Steiner is not your friend, you need to make him your friend because he's good. The fact that we are hearing globally and that some countries are pulling back from their climate commitments. For this audience internationally, let me be clear, Canada is not one of those countries. We are firm in our commitments at this point, and very pleased and proud that we made commitments at Baku to support developing nations and the work that needs to happen in those countries with 1.4 billion in blended finance for emerging markets. So I think that's just an example of the leadership that Canada is taking sort of well beyond our own boundaries. One of the things I often say when we talk about sort of the challenge with energy transition is that it is a green revolution. And if we think back to the Industrial Revolution and we say, why would we have thought that this green revolution was going to be easy? It's not easy. You're changing the way we do things, and during the first industrial revolution, you were building new and better all the time. We're building new and better, but it involves stopping doing some of the ways we were doing things in the past. And I think from a societal perspective, as you said, I was in public life, and now I'm privileged to lead Invest in Canada, and I've been in the economic development space for just almost 10 years. Change is hard. Change is hard. And it involves really thinking creatively about how we can do things. And you need leaders both in business, who we've heard from some this morning here in this government needs to be part of it, industry needs to be part of it. So, I think those things are happening. And we all need to encourage the innovators amongst us, even if it's not ourselves, because it's those individuals who are going to find those solutions for tomorrow. And in the role that I have, I'm so privileged to be able to speak to those innovators all around the world, hear what they are trying to develop, and bring forward those solutions that we all need.
Change is hard, indeed, and it's not a linear process. Is it? There are many setbacks along the way. And I think that here the message is pretty clear. The energy transition remains a very compelling story for Canada, and according to you, for the rest of the world, of course. What's been lacking somehow in this energy transition is finance, of course, but it's also a stronger commitment by the private sector. And I know you feel very strongly about this, Laurel. You've been a strong advocate for its role in funding the energy transition alongside government, of course. So, based on all the events you attend, the conversations you're having with leaders at global companies about their commitment to the energy transition and to investments, what are you hearing at the moment?
So I'm hearing right around the globe, and for corporate leaders who have it in the DNA of their corporations now, that they are moving forward, looking for solutions, driving that change no matter what governments are saying. And we heard that in the room here today. CEOs are concerned about climate risk. They're concerned about the risk on their own business operations. We are seeing the impact of climate globally, and they have smart, thoughtful teams who are driving for better, who are coming up with solutions. And one of the challenges, as you've said, is the fact that this transition is costly. It's expensive. It takes investments to, generate the new technologies. But we're seeing that. I can just give a few recent examples in Canada that are really, really exciting. So Dow Chemical, it has its world's first net zero emissions ethylene cracker in Alberta. It's an $11.5 billion project, and its capacity to decarbonize the manufacturing process is something that is a game changer for us in Canada. BHP, who I know the CEO, Mike Henry, will be here tomorrow if he's not already here today. And this audience is going to be excited to hear about that BHP project in Saskatchewan, a potash project, Saskatchewan, where I was born. So I'm also excited that that's happening there. And, how is that connected to well, first of all, it's going to be the greenest facility ever, but that fertilizer will help make greener, more productive crops globally. So I think that's another great example. And then just a couple of weeks ago, I was on the construction site of Asahi Kasei's facility in Ontario, being built in Ontario. They're part of the electric vehicle supply chain, a partner of Honda's, building a massive new giga facility. So I think we're seeing those investments come in across the country, driven by corporations and leaders who understand the role that they play and who also believe it's good business decisions to be making sustainable investments.
Absolutely, and you've highlighted something important here. It's the fact that the private sector and the world of finance in particular may have been a bit slow at offering the various products and the right environment we need for further investments. But nevertheless, but there's something that is worrying to insurance companies in particular, and this notion of risk you've mentioned. They may not want to invest in technologies to tackle climate change, but they have to adapt, and that's very costly as well. So in terms of creating the right framework for further investments, in the US, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act, well, it's been the largest US investment in climate policy. Canada also has significant incentives in place to support the energy transition. If the IRA is dramatically altered, what is going to be the impact on Canada's programs and incentives to stimulate energy transition in investments? Will you change your tune somehow? And beyond competitiveness, isn't green diplomacy at play here as well? Let's face it, with China, for instance, having a massive advantage when it comes to green tech, which of course would translate not just in economic, but somehow, yeah, diplomatic advantage. So how do you locate yourself on that map?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know the future ahead. But again, I go back to the conversations that I'm having with business leaders who have made investment decisions, who are building up, innovating amazing technology that is so solutions oriented, who are driven by having a positive impact on their communities, on their country, on the planet. And I don't think those things are only tied to incentives. You know, we talk sometimes when we're in government, we talk about carrots and sticks. Do you use a stick to get what you want, or do you use a carrot? So clearly a carrot is an incentive. But I also think society has really broadened. And, you know, I've been privileged to sit at leaders forums at COP with leaders at Climate Week in New York, at Sustainable Markets Initiative, all those companies who are making moonshots, who are saying, we are going to strive for this. We've innovated this technology, and we think that this is a really solid solution. So what has Canada done in response? If we go back in time to when the Inflation Reduction Act came in, absolutely. I was here in Europe last year at this conference. People were talking about the impact of the IRA. What we did in Canada is we believed that the IRA drew eyes to North America. People looking at, well, what's happening in North America? And we responded, the country responded, the government responded, and as the Investment Attraction Agency, we were able to tell the story of Canada, of what we had put on the table, and the integration of the economies across North America, and the fact that Canada is a trading nation with multiple free trade agreements all around the world. And so I think that you respond to the situation that you have in front of you. That's certainly what the government of Canada will be doing. We renegotiated our current free trade agreement during President Trump's last mandate, and are leaning in to being able to continue to be a good partner to the United States, who is our closest neighbor.
So let's dive a little bit deeper into the reasons why Canada is a compelling investment destination for energy transition investments in particular. You mentioned incentives, of course, but what are you going to be doing in very concrete terms to make those investments possible? And a reminder, I mentioned it in my introduction, that Canada is already a global leader in renewable energy power generation, with 83% of your grid, of your power coming from non-emitting sources like renewable and nuclear energy as well. And of course, you are committed to a target of net zero emissions by 2050. So tell us more. Speaking time.
For sure. So 83% non-emitting electrical grid across the country is a huge part of our value proposition. For those who are corporate leaders in this audience, they know that when you start talking about scope 1, 2, and 3, you're going to have to measure out your impact on the entire life of your product. So that is critical. If you're building anything that is to drive sustainability, you need clean electricity. So that is a key part of it. In response to the Inflation Reduction Act, Canada has put in a number of tax credits for targeted areas: hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, clean tech, a variety of different sectors. And those tax credits are stable, are transparent, and are very easily understood by businesses who are determining what incentive will I get if I build this type of facility. So since the evolution to tax credits, we've been able to work closely with companies to have them clearly understand that calculation. So what else do you need when you're making your investment decision? You need resources, both natural and human resources, to say where is your talent going to come from. So that is also a big part of what Canada has on offer in terms of a highly educated STEM-based talent stream and a diverse population that bring that lens of diversity and creativity. I mean, those statistics are very clear around the world that if you have diverse workforces, you have creative workforces, you drive innovation. So I think that's a big part of the conversation that we have. Where are we located? I live on the east coast of Canada. Those ports are the closest to Europe, and that's why you saw the Chancellor from Germany there a number of years ago with the agreement that Canada could deliver from those eastern seaboard ports, hydrogen as an example. In Western Canada, very much connected to Asia Pacific from the west of Canada, our closest neighbors to the south being the United States, and our free trade agreements, 51 countries, 15 trade agreements, 1.5 billion consumers is the access that those free trade agreements in Canada provide to those who establish themselves in Canada. So we have a very strong value proposition, one that I'm really privileged to be able to talk about regularly, but you don't have to just take it from me or our video. There's others that have said we have been recognized as second in the world for green energy by Rystad, first by Bloomberg NEF on the battery supply chain, and AT Kearney FDI Confidence Index always recognizes us globally as one of the top markets. So I think those barometers internationally demonstrate the consistency that Canada has had in our offering.
Thank you very much. What about electrification and EVs in particular in Canada? Because we've had a few setbacks within the industry, haven't we? What with Northvolt, for instance, it's really dampened investors' appetite. So what is your own take, or maybe your conclusion, on the long-term viability of this industry and its potential for the future? And same there again in relation to what you're doing in Canada.
So again, I think we go back to that revolutionary change. No one should think it's going to be a straight line, but what we are seeing is an increasing appetite by consumers. So Canada had EV sales were up by 35% in 2023. So significant increase, and EV adoption hit an all-time high at 16% of all new vehicle registrations. So I think that's a concrete demonstration of the adoption of e-vehicles, of the build-out of the support framework that is needed for electric vehicles, because again, a significant change. And constant evolution in terms of the range, all of the things. We have a cold climate in Canada, not always cold, but sometimes cold. And so, all of those elements were causing anxiety to people. I remember, in 2005 as Minister of Environment, being in one of the very first hybrid, we were just starting to talk about that, and the regulation wasn't ready and all of these things, but we've really made significant progress in that time, and the population is keeping up with us, and in many instances moving faster than the societal machinery is moving. So they push governments, and that's important, and they push that adoption, and we're seeing that in Ontario.
Thank you very much, Laurel. Now, before we conclude this session, yes, sadly, we're running out of time. I'd like to ask the room, maybe, do we have any sustainability leaders amongst us? Raise your hand if you're one of them.
Everybody should be putting their hand up. I know a lot of people in this room.
And the reason why I'm asking, Laurel, is because you mentioned, and you have a sustainability mindset, haven't you? It's a mindset at the end of the day. It's a culture. And a lot of people have been feeling a little bit depleted or deflated after the results of the US elections and what it means for the transition. So I'd like to conclude this session by asking you about how you feel about the longer-term future of the transition. Let's look ahead in 5, maybe 10 years. What do you think is next? And I also want you maybe to reflect on your own journey, because when you were elected, and I was back in 2003, Canada's government was set to become the first jurisdiction in North America to eliminate coal-fired electricity generation. At the time, coal represented about 25% of Ontario's electricity mix. 10 years later, it produced 0. Okay? So what's the right way to go about this, and how can you achieve success, especially when faced with, setbacks, I guess?
Well, I think we start by recognizing transition is always a journey, but you need to know on that journey, where do you want to go? So that moonshot concept of putting out that flag, this is where we're going. Do we know exactly how we're going to get here? Not necessarily. We don't know how we will get to net zero, but it is our North Star in our country of how are we going to make that movement. And it will be a lot of different pieces. You have to just recognize where we've come as a society. So in 2005, that was the Ontario government's first climate change plan. That's not that long ago. I had my twin boys that year, and they're not even 20 yet. So that's how far we've moved. So on the coal, eliminating coal from our electrical generation, you have to start building the blocks. It's like a puzzle. And that's what governments and that's what businesses do. What are the pieces? We can reduce consumption. Okay, that helps us here. We can build better other clean generation, solar, wind, other forms of electricity. You build those up, and that really is, when I've been privileged to sit at leaders' tables at COP and hear those who are driving hydrogen aviation, sustainable fuel aviation, that is really what is taking place. They're saying, we need to get here, and that's why I do feel hopeful, because there are such smart, amazing people around the world and in this room, and I see some of them here. I know some of these friends of mine in this room who are working hard every day to come up with those solutions. So I guess the encouragement I would have for all of us is to listen to those solutions, to come to learn that technology. I feel hopeful because I get to sit down with those companies every day and understand what they're building, what they're creating, what the opportunity is before us. And then we need to put the pieces together and figure out, well, how will we get that built and how will we scale it? Because it's great to have something that works on a micro scale, but we need it scaled. And I feel confident that when rooms like this gather around the world, you got the right people in here to make it happen. So that's my challenge to the room.
So it's on you, in other words. Thank you very much, Laurel. What a great conversation, which I would have liked to pursue, but we've got to wrap up. Thank you very much. Laurel Bruyton, CEO of Invest in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. It's fun.
Merci, mesdames. We will discuss scaling lower carbon economies at speed. Please welcome Rita Jo Lewis, Chair and President of Export-Import Bank of the United States.
thank you so much. It is such an honor to be able to be here at FEIA. And it's even more of an honor to be here with our strongest allies from U.S. Europe, U.S. France, U.S. Canada. And so, Nick, we just want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to join you and talk about a very important subject. And as we have listened to the different panelists today, one of the things has become very clear is that the conversation always is not just about the opportunities, but who are going to be able to finance those. And so today's discussion, although very, very timely, we know that 2023, now 2024, and now as we move to 2025, is going to be a very big turning point, especially on carbon emissions. And so one of the things that we see as a defining moment is not just to act, but to lead on how we can continue the green energy transition at the speed and scale necessary while fostering growth and equity across the world. And so that scaling and that speed, we believe, comes through work that will have to be done by agencies like the Export-Import Bank of the United States. EXIM is our official export credit agency. We are an executive branch agency of the U.S. government with one single mission, and that is to support American jobs by facilitating the exports of U.S. goods and services. And so one of the things we have to also remind, it is not just about supporting our goods, it's also supporting our foreign buyers who want to purchase those goods and services to be exported. You know, since its establishment 90 years ago, EXIM has played a critical role in fostering economic opportunity for U.S. companies, small businesses, and for partner nations that our companies do business with around the world. As an institution, we offer direct loans, loan guarantees, and insurance products, all backed by the full faith and credit of the United States to support those exports of goods and services. And so in 2019, when U.S. EXIM was reauthorized, one of the things that became loud and clear was the work that needed to be done on the financing side. EXIM is an institution that was authorized with a lending cap of over $135 billion. In the last 3 years, we have done over $25 billion, in all total about $35 billion. So we have $100 billion left of that lending cap. So being at meetings like this gives us the opportunity to meet those companies that are looking to scale and to meet and understand more about the technologies and the work that has gone on here in Europe and around the world. The thing that is so interesting for us is that at U.S. EXIM, we're very, very simple. It's that when the private sector lenders are unable or unwilling to provide financing, we are charged to fill in the gap for American businesses by equipping them with the financing tools necessary to compete for global sales. And we always like to say, we don't need you to just compete, we need you to also win. But also at EXIM, sustainability is more than a priority. It is embedded in our mission. It is embedded in our mission from our charge from our U.S. Congress as well as from the administration. So it is within those mandates that we have been working through opportunities to drive the global energy transition by advancing clean and renewable energy projects. We believe our track record speaks for itself. In 2021, we had funded only $11 million in climate-related transactions, supporting only 50 U.S. jobs. 2022, we grew to $175 million, supporting 550 jobs. In 23, we authorized over $950 million in climate transactions for supporting 4,700 jobs, a tenfold increase in just 3 years. And then in this last fiscal year, we've doubled our investment in energy and environmentally beneficial exports, growing from $1.1 billion in 23 to a record of $2.3 billion, our largest ever clean energy investments. This transaction that we did represents over a fourth of our portfolio this year and includes a $1.7 billion in renewable energy projects. We believe that the data speaks for itself. We know that having decarbonization success stories are emerging across industries. Which unite them is the strategic integration of innovative technologies and collaborative partnerships. Projects like our recent investments in Malaysia, which incorporates cutting-edge carbon reduction technologies, demonstrates how industrial processes can cut emissions by as much as 30%. We also have been introducing new tools. We believe that it is very important that we have to have these tools in order for us to make the kinds of strides that we need to continue to do for the future. We know that we have been also in the forefront in the financing of nuclear energy projects for more than 5 decades. And I know that there is going to be numerous conversations here this week and that has been taking place, especially at all of our COPs, around the transformation that this sector has. And we know that since COP27, we have demonstrated our commitment on numerous key initiatives. Most recently, especially in the nuclear space, we have authorized nearly $100 million to advance Romania's SMR power projects under our engineering multiplier program. You know, these projects are very complex and they require a great deal of money. But what they require most is advocacy. And beyond that advocacy, we understand it has to be about public-private partnerships. So I believe that the work that all of us have been discussing here today and tomorrow, we'll continue to see how we can not only facilitate, but how we can accelerate the financing that is going to be needed. And so we look forward to continued conversations around our financing, but also to talk about how in America we have also built programs around what we call initiatives around what we call Make More in America to strengthen our supply chains with these types of projects. We know that programs like what we call MMIA also would then lead to scaling opportunities around this particular sector. So we understand that we all need to seize the moment, we need to be innovative, but more importantly, we need to act. And that's why the financing and the partnerships and collaborations that we do with our G7 partners, our G20 friends, the Quad, APEC, ASEAN, you name it. Whether you're in a multilateral perspective or whether we look at this from a bilateral perspective, we know that one agency, one country, one industries, one sector is not going to be able to do it alone. It's going to require all of us working together for us to reach the goals that we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita, Joe. Merci beaucoup, Rita. Coming up next,
thank you very much.
We have an exciting panel, Scaling Lower Carbon Economies at Speed. I will turn things over to Charlotte. Please welcome Charlotte Reed, France, Italy, and Spain correspondent for CNBC. I will turn things over to Charlotte, but first I want to remind you that the conference is translated live from French to English and English to French. You can find a handset under your seat, and you can be able to use this service. Charlotte Reed, and our guests.
Thanks for coming to listen to this very interesting conversation, actually listening to people that make the change happen. So 2024 is going to go down as a year with the highest carbon emissions ever recorded. So we've made some progress, I feel like, especially after COVID, after the pandemic. There was a renewed sense of urgency, and we saw some actions like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Next Gen EU fund that really helped accelerate finance the carbon transition. But it also feels like we're hitting a snag. So let's have a chat here and discuss all these elements with the 3 guests I have here. Just next to me, Philippe Guérin, the CEO of Solvay, Jean-Marc Aulagnier, Chairman EME of Accenture, and Aurélia Hamel, President for Strategy and Sustainability at Total Energy. So Jean-Marc, maybe ask you first to set the scene for us of all the progress that has been made, those IRA, Next Gen EU, all this progress that has been done until 2023, 2024.
So thanks, Charlotte. Maybe the lack of progress as well, as you mentioned. But
we'll go to that afterwards.
No, I think the way we look at it at Accenture as we serve, large-scale enterprise, my conviction for many years has been we are not going to decarbonize the whole world without a very significant role of business. And that seems obvious, but we know that this energy transition requires multi-stakeholders approach. We need to coordinate different people in order to ensure on the ground this energy transition is really happening. But I think, and we believe, like I hope my colleague here, that the business has a key role to play. That's why what we do every year is we survey and we also look at data, the reporting data we have now around carbon emissions, to look at the real progress we are making. And there is always a balanced view here. You will see there are some progress, and I think it's good to see. When you look at, especially in the last 4 years, there have been plenty of reason for business to do something else than sustainability. But when you look at the data will suggest that the business remains more and more committed to their net zero agenda. Today, we have 37% of the G2000, so the survey focused on the 2,000 largest companies in the world, which are the ones that contribute to the emission. 37% of them have a commitment to net zero on scope 1, 2, and 3. More interestingly, 65% of them have a commitment on net zero for scope 1 and 2, which demonstrates the complexity of scope 3, which is certainly a topic we're going to come from. And this has increased every year. It has increased every year, including last year, which demonstrates the commitment of the business to contribute for their part to that. Now, coming back to where we are around the world, Europe is still leading. So European companies are still leading, despite everything we say around some of the European bureaucracy or whatever. And I will say this year more than ever, which I find interesting because today, if you compare to the 37% of average that I mentioned of G2000 company committed to scope 1, 3, 2 and 3, 64% are committed in Europe, which is a very significant percentage compared to what you see in North America and the rest of the world, which are half of that number, which demonstrate that all the regulation in Europe has created some kind of momentum. And obviously what we see in China and US to catch up may be something important as well. So that's a bit on the high level, and I'm happy to comment in more detail. The real issue is the pace. Are we on track to achieve that when you look at the current level of reduction of emission? And the answer is clearly no. Even for the companies that are doing the right things, there's very few companies that are reducing carbon emission today at the pace required to achieve 2050 agenda. And that demonstrates that we need to accelerate. We have all the lever. Many of the industry, especially professional services, B2C industries, have generated the technology through energy efficiency, electrification to achieve net zero. It's not that simple, but I think we have, and that will be, I'm sure, a discussion with my colleague here, we have the heavy industry that needs help. Because first, they are the scope 3 of many of the others, but they also are not on track today because of business model, pricing of green steel, pricing of energy, but also the decarbonization technology is much more complicated. It's just not electrification only. It's going to require storage, hydrogen, green gas type of thing, which is much more complicated, and that's why those industries are a bit behind in terms of pace. But this is very important that overall we help them. So that gives you a bit of a picture of where we are, and I'd be happy to get into any more detail.
And we will going further. Philippe, if I can ask you, of course, you're the CEO of a large chemicals company, Solvay. I believe you were one of the companies that invested, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, in the US as well before the split of the company. Can you just tell us how you saw that as an opportunity and the kind of work that you're doing to decarbonize your industry?
Yes, maybe a few words first, because it's true that CO2 emissions are increasing year after year. It's not the case for the industry. The industry has been working for a very long time on CO2 emission reduction. If I take the example of Solvay, and that's very important to understand because it also explains why it costs more and more. Versus 2005, you remember 2005, it's the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol. We started to measure at this time. We reduced our CO2 emissions by a factor of 3. So it's true that today we are in the hard stuff. The low-hanging fruits, they're gone. And so what we have in front of us costs a lot of money, and it's the whole question on how can we finance it in a world, we are in all of our businesses at Solvay, competing at a global scale. And one of the main roadblock to decarbonize is unfair competition. Unfair competition, because how can you invest, for example, in Europe, when you decide that it's okay to import the pollution? And when we say we are decreasing our CO2 emissions in Europe, in the industry, it's also partly due to the shutdown of the industry. So is this what we want? My answer is no. No, because our vision at Solvay is that we should move to a model where more and more we produce regionally. We have plants everywhere in the world. We are selling everywhere in the world. So we should have short, supply chains. But to have these short supply chains, you need to make sure that you have fair competition. And how do you do that? But sometimes you can use the IRA, so you put a lot of money to make sure that you can have production in the US.
That's not fair competition, is it?
No, I mean, it's not fair competition, but it's needed. It's needed because we don't have fair competition. So in Europe, we are trying to find ways as well, but we are too slow. We're shutting down the industry in Europe because we are not taking the right measures. So this is really what we need to talk about, is we need to have the industry. The energy transition does not mean that the industry must disappear. We are producing essential products, essential chemicals. If we are not there, there is no window. So there is no energy saving program. You don't have double glazing, whatever. There is no low consumption tires. We would consume 30–40% more fuel. So it's needed to have those products. Now the whole thing is, how do we produce them? And how do we make sure that we can have this fair competition?
I think the point of competition is really interesting, because things that might be good for decarbonization, say electric cars, well, there's a lot of cheap Chinese electric cars coming, which would be good as a goal to reach the targets, is not good for the European car makers. So it's a really difficult thing to reconcile, isn't it? The industry goal and the decarbonization goal, right?
And that's because, this industry is heavily subsidized in China. That's the only reason why we can have cheaper Chinese car. And if we have incentives, we fuel this whole chain, by the way, because we incentivize people to buy those cars. So that's really a political decision. We are producing rare earth at Solvay, rare earth to produce electric vehicles. Today, 100% of the rare earth to produce permanent magnets is for electric vehicles, come from China, because it's subsidized, but we can produce them at the right price.
Yeah, and we'll come afterwards to the conversation of reshoring and cutting short the supply chain, because that's a really interesting conversation. Aurélien, let me come to you as well, because of course you are a key player in all this transition. Total Energy, of course, you were just Total, but you changed the name in 2021 to reflect the strategy shift and how to signal the diversification towards cleaner energy sources as well. So just explain to us how that's happening and how you're supporting industries as well in that shift.
Well, thank you for having me today. Just sharing some good news, and there are also bad news in the broader discussion on climate change. It is true that we've witnessed in the last 5 to 10 years, certainly accelerating in the last 5 years, a decoupling between GDP growth, people getting richer, countries getting richer, and use of fossil fuels. So you have less and less carbon emissions that go into adding $1 of wealth for humanity, basically. So that's good news. There is the decoupling, and basically what we need to do is to accelerate that trend, because it's not going fast enough. It's going in the right direction, something people often overlook, but if you take the International Energy Agency base scenario, let's say, for energy scenarios called STEPS, that one scenario, STEPS, in 2016, just after the Paris Agreement, had an implied increase in temperature by the end of the century of 2.7 degrees. That was 8 years ago. The same STEPS scenario this year, 2024, has a 2.4 degrees implied heating at the end of the century. That's 0.3 degrees better in the course of 8 years. That's around 420 gigatons of CO2 less that goes into the atmosphere. So that's actually significant. So I agree, the industry actually, especially in Europe, has gone in the right direction. Now, how do we do? It's all a matter, has been discussed, of ecosystems. It's not about climate change, and fighting climate change is around energy. Energy is 80% fossil fuels today, still on the face of Earth. And it's about the energy transition, but the energy transition is about energy ecosystems transitioning. You need to change the supply, you need to change the demand. And there are things that we can do on just one side only. I'll start with that, for instance. We, as an industrial player, we produce oil and gas, now we also produce electricity. As an industrial player, we emit a lot of methane. Methane, is a gas that's now in the public discussion, and that's a good thing, because methane is the second largest heating gas in the atmosphere after CO2. Methane is very much short-lived. It stays for 10 years, around 10 years in the atmosphere, but it has a bigger heating effect than CO2. It's in the course of 20 years, that's 80 times more than CO2. So methane comes from 3 sources on the face of Earth, let's say from human activities. One is oil and gas production. There's coal too, actually, that emits methane. The other one is waste, and the third one is breeding and agriculture. We are in the oil and gas industry. So how do we address that? First, on our own, we set targets. We've decided to reduce methane emissions in our operations by 80% between 2020 and 2030. We've just reached minus 50% this year. And then you need to track progress. We've just decided to install permanent methane detection equipments on all of our upstream oil and gas production sites around the globe by the end of 2025. But then, because that's a matter of how you move the needle, it's good to do something for your own company, and we're doing that. We have targets, we monitor the progress, we have action plans for that. But then you need to bring the whole industry with you. And what we've done is we've contributed a lot to something called the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter. It's called OGDC. It was launched at COP28 in Dubai a year ago. And through this, we are working with 54 oil and gas companies, both state-owned, national oil companies, and privately owned companies, so that together we all set targets to reduce methane emissions by the end of the decade. And these companies taken together represent almost half of the oil and gas production worldwide. So when you do that, when you collaborate, and I think that's key in the whole energy transitioning order of things, when you do that, when you collaborate, you can actually move the needle for a system at large and not just for your own company. That's one of the starting places.
Because you talk about the oil and gas industry in particular, can I ask you, because we've seen some of your competitors in particular being very much under pressure from some investors, not being happy with the shift towards more green targets and kind of rolling back on some of these objectives as well. So how do you balance it? How do you make the financial argument for this transition as well to your investors?
It's a very good point, because as a company, we will only invest in greener sources of energy, and I'll get to some details around that, if our investors, because they own the company at the end of the day, will let us do so. And it's true that you need to have an investment case if you're going to do that. So the way we've done that in the last 5 years very significantly is we allocate roughly 2/3 of our investment to oil and gas, doing that, lowering methane emissions, lowering CO2 emissions in our operations, and then we allocate around 1/3 of our investments to low carbon energy. It's around between $4 and $5 billion a year. That's a lot of money, even for a company like us, that go to low carbon electricity, integrated power. And the way we do that, so that our investors will be okay for us to do that, especially when other oil and gas majors either have not gone down that route, for instance in the US, others elsewhere in Europe have gone for that route and then gone elsewhere more recently. The way we do that is we want to have a distinguishing model. We're not going to become a utility. Utilities have more than their role to play in the transition. But we want to offer a different model to our investors where we integrate along the value chain. What we've done in oil for 100 years, gas for 50, 60 years, we want to do in electricity. Basically, we integrate in production, transformation, transportation, sale of energy products. It's been oil, it's been liquefied natural gas, and now it's going to be power. It is power today. And by doing so, you integrate a value chain. You do take risks at some points in the value chain, but that's where you capture value. And we have that, that legacy in our business that we are very good at capturing value in the value chain of the energy system. We're doing that with power, and by doing that, we offer our investors double-digit returns, as we say. We're close to the 10% return on our electricity business that we report on a standalone basis. And because we can generate revenues, profits out of that business that we are constructing, our investors are happy for us to do so, because investors, they want us to have a long-term transition vision, and they're very supportive of that on all sides, including on the other side of the Atlantic. Frankly, investors, even though maybe they've gone more quiet in this respect, they like that. So they let us do that, but at the same time, we offer a return. And that's very important to be able to move the whole system if you want to have an investable business case.
You all alluded to the fact that it's really expensive to make those investments for that transition. But at the same time, it was the low-hanging fruits until now. So it's the hard part starts now, right? So does that mean you're going to need even more money? And then where does that money come from?
I think the problem is not the financing itself, the money. I mean, there is enough money in the world to finance a good project. The problem is to find the best projects. And what is a good project is a project that allows you to do your energy transition and at the same time stay competitive. So if it costs you, 2 or 3 times more to put double glazing, no one will put those type of windows, and we won't do the right projects. So we need to stay competitive at the same time. That's why, as industrial, when we look at those projects, we don't look at the return on investment. Doesn't make any sense, because I can define a baseline where costs are increasing forever, and the return will be fantastic. What we need is to preserve the level of competitiveness. And so it means you need to find the right project. And it's not always the same type of project, because it very much depends on what is available locally. In Brazil, I can use bagasse. Bagasse is the residue of sugarcane. I cannot do that in Europe, obviously. So in Europe, I have to find something else. I can find recycled waste, I can find waste wood, biomass, whatever. So you need to find the right project, and then you cannot succeed alone, clearly. I mean, you cannot succeed alone. You need to be supported by the whole value chain, meaning the customers of your customers, and so on. We also need to be ready to support, as end consumers, this type of projects. And you need to be supported by the policymakers as well, so that they put the right money at the right place. Because the main problem that we have is that, you mentioned IRA, and you're right, our IRA is, it's always this story of the carrot and the stick. IRA is a carrot, and it makes the investment possible. In Europe, we have only sticks. So we invest not to pay additional costs. This does not make a business case. If you want to invest, you need to generate value, not to avoid paying more.
And that's reflected in reality. So a barometer of investment from European industrial groups, and they say it's from McKinsey that 37% of European investment went to the US, and 33% went to Europe. So European companies are investing more in the US than Europe.
It's not linked only to energy transition. I think if we separate a bit the topic is, as I say, we have many industries that have an affordable way to achieve and make progress. Even my industry, tech sector, will be the next big wave of decarbonization through electrification, because we are going to have to do that, and we are doing it. But I think what is different, and I have a lot of sympathy for Philippe because we know each other, is, when you look at the heavy energy-intensive industry, they are facing something very unique in terms of competition, where energy price in Europe, and it has been worse after this Ukraine war, are more expensive than in China and in North America right now. That's the reality of where we are. So we ask them not only to decarbonize, which is already quite of a challenge, but also to be competitive with one of the major sources of their competitiveness being energy at a higher price. So they have more of an effort to do. That's why I was saying it is visible today that this industry is making a lot of effort. And I'm talking about chemicals, steel, cement, all the really energy-intensive industry, which needs some level of support, because either we want that kind of industry across the world, as you say, in North America, in Europe, in Asia, but we have to accept that this difference of energy price is quite of a problem, first, of competitiveness, and after you ask them to decarbonize, you say, well, let's be competitive first to survive, and after we'll eventually decarbonize. So that's a very unique situation Philippe and some of his friends are facing.
And that's a bit, again, I'm going back to the electric car situation, but you had an industry that
That's another topic, because cars, you have different things. In the energy transition is touching everything, so that's what makes it interesting. No, it's a more of a competitiveness issue and subsidy issue. So yes, you also have this kind of
You
thing.
also say it's about competitiveness, but I guess...
I agree, but it's a different kind of solution. I agree that in some industry, you are facing some unfair competitiveness, and that's something to be addressed as well.
But there's other industry, I guess, the wind farm industry, the batteries, all these industries that are at the forefront of the transition have taken a battering recently. So how do you convince an industries to continue investing, continue push for the transition? We see that some of the industries that have done it actually paying the price for it now.
I think, look, when you look at it, when you are, as I say, in different sectors, much less complicated, we see energy transition on being sustainable as a part of doing business. If you want to attract people, if you want to sell product to customer, you better do the right things for your environment, because that's a criteria to be successful in business, is also to do the right things for what is around us. And I think I can tell you, when you talk to young generation, to customer, this is also an important thing. So do the right things for business, make a lot of things. So now, as I say, many industry can do it, and we are doing it. When it's about your survival as a company, well, you need to survive first, because if you don't survive, you can be clean with no plant, as you say in Europe. We're going to be clean, but I'm not sure that's the right solution. So that's why we need, and that's beyond what we can discuss here, but we need to define industrial policies that make some decision around how much chemical industry we want left in Europe, for example.
And so on that, there's a new European Commission that's just starting. We had the Draghi report recently, very much linking European competitiveness to decarbonization, etc. So what do you hope to see from the new Commission in terms of priorities, in terms of more carrot and less stick, I guess?
Yes, you're right. I mean, and we were all together in February in Antwerp, and we signed a declaration to say, we want to continue and even speed up with the Green Deal, but we need to have an industrial deal. Otherwise, the Green Deal will be done by shutting down the plants in Europe. So we had this declaration. We had the Draghi report, which I think highlights, that we have a big problem in Europe. And again, I mean, I look at it in a very balanced way, because Solvay is a global player, so we're producing everywhere. So we look at what's happening in Europe versus what we have elsewhere. We had the election, so today nothing has happened since February. You see, I mean, this is the scale we're talking about. I mean, we need quick decisions. So I think there is an awareness that builds up. There is good intentions, but there needs to be acts now, really acts. And when I say act, is to make sure that we can, in fact, compensate this unfair competition, that we can also not always add, more regulations, but also put regulations that will support, the industry. I have a customer that wants me to produce from recycled material. Well, I can do it in China, but not in Europe, because it's considered as a waste. So we have the regulations that we don't need, and we don't have the ones that we need. So we need, and this is about trust, It's about talking together and trusting each other. There is not enough trust, I think, between the industry and the policymaker. That's the key point.
And also, I guess you need some political will behind it, and you need countries to take the lead, whether it's European country members or whatever, and you have France got its own domestic political drama, Germany having their own election soon. So do you lack this sort of leadership at a country level and leaders to actually push things through in the EU at the moment?
We cannot say that we are living in a world that is completely certain and with a clear vision and so on. That's for sure. And for industrials, it's a big problem not to have this clear visibility. We can build it. I mean, we have good ideas. We don't need big political decisions. We can make it work with the policymakers in line with the targets. I think we all have the same vision. We want a cleaner world. We want a competitive world and so on. We as industrial have a lot of things to propose.
If we look again back to the US, of course, the big change happening in 2025 is Donald Trump coming back to the White House. How much of a shift might that be? You know, he said, drill, baby, drill. I don't know if that's good news for Total Energy or not. But what kind of shift also taking the US out of the Paris Agreement, all these kind of changes I said he would do? What does that mean overall for reaching those targets?
Well, I guess I'll start because of the drill thing. First, something to keep in mind, the US have never produced so much oil and gas domestically from the US ground as under the Biden administration. Today, the US is the very large, dominant energy champion of the world. They produce tons of oil. They are the main producer of oil around the world before Saudi Arabia. They're the main LNG, liquefied gas producer around the world. So I'm not sure it will change a lot, frankly, just because there's a political motto during the campaign. The US will stay a dominant supplier of oil and gas for the US, hence the cheap energy that they have, and for the rest of the world, namely Europe. Actually, Europe buys a lot of American LNG and oil too, and some of that goes to China, actually. Now, having said that, when you look at what's happening in the US and the new administration coming in, there is a very strong business momentum for the transition that's not going to disappear. I'm very much confident about that. There's one thing that's connected with the policy mix. They have a lot of carrots in the US, certainly, with the IRA. Some of the IRA will be adjusted, but the IRA in the US has benefited a lot of Republican districts. And this is not going to disappear because a lot of jobs, US jobs in Republican-held districts are supported by the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is not going to go away. And it is true that a lot of companies, and we do that too, we invest a lot in the US. The US have always been a very good place to do business and invest. It's not new and it's not related to the IRA only. But there's been a boost, and there's a boost to electricity generation. We are a big player in Texas. We don't produce oil in Texas. We are in the gas and LNG business in Texas. We're the largest US LNG exporter, actually, as a company. But we are growing very significantly in the power business in Texas. We install a lot of wind farms, solar farms, and they have a lot of sun, and they have a lot of wind. They have a lot of available land in the US, which we don't have in Europe. There's a lot of land in the US that's available, and Europe is very much dense, so you have less land to do your solar and wind farm business. So we do a lot of that, and there's a lot of demand because of very strong industry, very strong service economy, very strong data centers demand. That's going to be driving a lot of the growth in power demand in the US, especially in Texas, in Virginia, in some places where it's, there's a great case to make investment in clean electricity, because all of the, the Magnificent Seven, as they call them, just for the sake of the anecdote, the oil majors were called the Seven Sisters back 50 or 60 years ago. That's disappeared. They are the majors now. We're one of them. But now we talk about the Magnificent Seven, the GAFAM, Tesla, and that drive so much power demand. And they have very strong targets to be carbon neutral in 2030, 2040, that there is a business case for suppliers of energy like us to invest in the US. That's what we lack in Europe. And one thing about what we've just discussed, I think what's key is that in the hopefully new policy settings that we'll have in 2025, which is a very important year because that's the year where it happens or not. That's a very important year, 2025, because there's the Draghi report, because there's public talk about that. The one thing that's very important is technological neutrality from the European policymakers. The European regulations have been very much policy oriented, which is not a good thing because you need to look at the cost merit curve, what's the cheapest available technology to support the industry and decarbonize at the same time. And if you want to go for the very state-of-the-art, high-tech solutions that cost a lot of money to start with, that's a bad place to start with. You need to go for the cheapest sources of technology that you can work upon collectively. I think that's going to be key in the 2025 debate here.
Yeah, and I can give an example about this technology industry, specifically in North America, as you mentioned, because it's interesting to see, the tech sector in the US has been front leading in terms of value creation, as we all know, but frankly also in terms of growth. This sector, which is highly regarded by everybody else, is going to consume a lot of energy. It's consuming already a lot of energy and will consume way more with AI, and I'm sure that there will be some question around that. I think the good news is that, as I see in other sectors, the large-scale companies, the one you mentioned, are the ones that are pushing the industry to decarbonize.
And investing in nuclear, aren't they?
Exactly. That's very interesting to see that they are not only requesting more renewable energy and low carbon energy, but they are also innovating with the industry. And typically your example of nuclear is quite an interesting one. They are ready to co-invest, or sometimes even to invest to do that. But it has been the same on renewable, on the way they mixed wind and solar through storage in order to really push the industry in terms of decarbonization. This is, I think, the right role that leading company can play. And this is certainly a good example that I think whatever administration will continue, because they are playing for the next decades. They are not playing for the next round of political election. And I think that's really important to see, because I see that in North America, I see that everywhere else. And that gives me the confidence that things are still moving, even though there are some challenges, as you know, Charlotte, right? Because there is a lot. But there are also good things happening.
Yeah, and the energy need from these tech companies and those investment in nuclear is because, of course, the expansion of AI and the servers that need energy.
Exactly. AI is a disruption which we are watching, because AI consumption on the current technology, though, is going to be astronomical. But you know what? The current technology will change, and we will find ways to leverage this AI technology, which seems to have some benefit for many industries, with a lower consumption, because the current technology will give us a level of consumption which is unsustainable. So we're going to have to fix that as well.
But on AI, if you can carry on, because of course it's changing for manufacturing, for supply chain. Enterprise AI is already at play, and I actually have a panel tomorrow on this as well with C3AI, which should be really interesting. How much of a game changer is it in terms of climate transition, etc., as a tool as well?
For us, it has a massive impact. So it's not so much AI; it's more digitalization and machine learning. Clearly, we see that in our plants. We have plants that are 150-year-old. So of course, we improved over the years, but still, we are continuously improving by putting, measures, machine learning, and then we can reduce the consumptions of raw material, of energy, reduce the maintenance costs, because we're doing predictive maintenance and not preventive maintenance anymore. So this is all, delivering tremendous results.
How about in the oil and gas industry as well? The AI revolution.
Yeah, so there's AI on the demand side of energy, and then there's AI on what it means for us as an energy producer. The impact actually is going to be huge. It's like computers in the 1990s. There was a famous phrase back then, like, we see computers everywhere, but not in productivity figures. And I think AI is at this stage today, so it's everywhere, not only in the discussion, but in our day-to-day lives on a personal and professional basis. But it is going to have a huge impact, because we'll see that in productivity figures. It's going to have a huge impact on how you manage energy demand. Managing energy demand is one of the one of the significant solutions to make better use of the existing energy, basically. So managing energy demand, having smart grids, how you make electricity, flow from one place where it's not needed at any given time to a place where it's needed at night, during the day, weekend, weekdays. That's going to have a huge impact there. It's going to have a huge impact on how we maximize energy production. In oil and gas, actually, there's the use of AI today on how you look at reservoirs and how you're going to do exploration, which means you'll have more targeted exploration, you'll be more productive in terms of what you look for. And then there's going to be AI for all of the new sources of energy. And you'll be able to map resources of where there's better sun radiation, where there's more wind, what is the wind pattern. Wind is very much for those who follow the news of the offshore wind and the wind industry. There's a phenomenon these days happening in Germany, namely in Northern Europe, where there's no wind, there's little sun this time of year. And basically, Germany has had to run on a lot of coal and gas to get its electricity, more than 80%. The UK, the same, actually, because there's been no wind in Scotland, or very little wind in Scotland. And so AI is going to help predict that with reasonable advance so that you can adjust and make better use of energy again. You need to have very significant grids and infrastructure. AI on its own is not going to do the trick because it's going to be an enabler, but then you need very brick and mortar infrastructures. You'll need a lot of electricity cables if you want AI to be able to move electrons from one place to the next.
We've talked a lot about Europe and the US, but we haven't talked about China and India. What kind of impact, what kind of players can they have, the new challenger, the new disruptor coming next? What's happening from their side of things in terms of the transition?
When you look at the energy mix, it's pretty different. You know, when you look at coal usage, it's mainly an Asian topic. You know, so I think energy security for those countries is linked to coal, and coal is something that are not ready to give up, because that's their energy security for those two countries, and that's going to be there for quite some time. So we're going to have to see, as part of their energy transition, how much they can build and do the new things. You know, they are very active, frankly. When you look at the investments they are doing, it's pretty interesting. But there is a base of coal for electricity generation that has nothing to do compared to the US and to Europe. So the timing of transition, and that's when you talk to the climate change people around the world, they've taken that into account, that it's going to take a longer time for them. That's why there is more pressure on North America and Europe to make progress, because we cannot ask them to go at the same pace. They are not going to discontinue coal because we ask them to discontinue coal tomorrow morning. You know, they are going to have their own pace of transition. And what is very unique to them is the centrality of coal for a generation of electricity for ages. And that's not going to change in the short term.
We're getting towards the end of the conversation. Net carbon zero 2050. How hopeful are you?
I think it's too late between you and me. I'm very hopeful, but I really think we need to move faster, and I hope that we will be able to do it faster. We took the commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. We will have our first site that is carbon neutral by 2030. It's one of our biggest sites, and it's in Brazil. They are already at minus 95% versus 2005. That's why I'm saying, you know, the last 5% are super expensive. This is why I wanted to make the point earlier on. The last step, so we are moving out of coal. You know, coal is the most competitive historically. We've been, implementing the plants on the coal mines. We don't have coal anymore, since 30, 40 years ago. So we need to find in Europe, we need to find in Europe, yes, we need to find again, the right source of primary energy that is available and low carbon. But the last step will be, I think, from a process point of view, electrification of the process, because those are the last CO2 tons that we'll have to abate. So this means that we have competitive, at least for my industry, competitive low-carbon electricity. This cannot be done without nuclear. I'm sorry. I don't see how this can be done without nuclear. So countries that don't have nuclear electricity will have a problem with their industry, for sure.
Aurélien, hopeful?
Well, something I wanted to point out is every year we do an exercise where we run scenarios, and we present scenarios on the energy possibilities of the future up until 2050. It's called the Total Energies Energy Outlook. We just presented a month ago the 6th edition of that. And when you look at let's say the trends scenario, which is one of the three, which is what's happening today and where do we see the energy world heading, and therefore the world heading, you see that China, back to China, is leading the way, and China has set a 2060 net zero ambition. They're on track to get there. Because what does it take to get to net zero? Let's look at what are the big emitters around the Earth. The energy-related emissions on Earth are almost 40 gigatons, 40 billion tons per year of CO2 equivalent. The main emitter is electricity generation, that's 14 gigaton. 75% of these emissions come from coal, back to this discussion we just had. And coal is going to stay in the mix because that's cheap, that's a sovereign source of energy that you can have without relying on others, basically. And because a coal-fired power plant lasts for 40 years, so nobody's going to shut down coal-fired power plants. So priority number one is to go to lower sources of electricity generation. And that the world knows how to do it. We have the technology, they're available in terms of cost. Now, the next thing, and it's been mentioned, we need to electrify the use of energy. Because it's one thing to have low carbon electricity, that's great. But if you have nothing to use that, that's just wasted energy. And you can't have that, and you won't have that. So what you need is more electric cars. China is selling 50% of electric cars as we speak in all new car sales. Europe is below 20% for the time being, likely going to be increasing next year. There are good signs in this respect. The US is around 7% of EV cars in their sales mix. And there are then a few other places where you have that. So electrifying transportation is going to be key. That's a collective challenge, and the world is not on track in this respect. And then the next one is the industry. And when you look again at the cheapest available technology, heat pumps, industrial heat pumps for, let's say, medium heat or medium-high heat, that's available, and that should be prioritized over things that are walk-on-the-moon technologies, basically. So going in the right direction, not fast enough, and I think it takes a huge collective effort with policymakers, with those who consume energy, with those who supply energy, we do both actually, to be able to get at the right place. Today, the world is not on track to meet the net zero 2050. Europe is not on track to meet its net zero 2050 targets, but we can and we will certainly accelerate altogether.
Jean-Marc, final words.
Yes, I think that's the right question at the end. I think the reality is, to be confident around 2050, we need to look at the fact that we are not on track. So let's face it, today, if nothing changed, we are not going to achieve it. So I think we need to have all of this collective effort on this mobilization. For me, I believe still that a couple of disruptive technology could make the difference. And I'm thinking about carbon storage. I'm thinking about battery and electricity storage. I'm thinking about hydrogen or green gas, new nuclear. I think we need something, and probably more than something, maybe 2 to 3 things that can be available in the next decade in order to scale some of the current issue we are facing. And I think that's going to be the collective wisdom and R&D effort of the world. Are we on track to find something that can be game-changing for 2050 or not? I think for me, it could make the difference. I think if we don't have that, it's going to be harder. So we need to bet on a couple of technology. When you look about a decade or two, that's a reasonable bet. We don't know yet what it is, but we can think that mankind is wise enough to find something that will make the difference. Because today, with a lot of good intention and also a lot of challenges, we are not on track.
Aurélien Hamel from Total Energy, Philippe Guérin, Solvay, and Jean-Marc Collanier from Accenture. Thank you so much for your insight and your time.
Scaling lower carbon energies at speed. Thank you, Charlotte Reed and her guests. Our next session, fireside chat session. Conversation au coin du feu. Very interesting. How mobile can become a library in your pocket. Please welcome Thierry Dassault, President of the Supervisory Board, Groupe Industriel Marcel Dassault, and Jean Pirlot de Corbion, founder and CEO of Uscribe.
à toutes et tous. J'espère que vous avez fait un agréable.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch and that you're not about to nap. You can nap, but not before half an hour from now.
expliquer.
Joan de Corbion, can you explain to us what this talk is going to be about? Good afternoon.
Je suis très heureux.
I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon with you. You were asking me about the title of this session. Well, you just basically need to
Qu'est-ce qu'on trouve
peek inside this suit. And what do you find in a pocket, usually? What basically all have is a smartphone.
Petit appareil.
This is just something that really doesn't take up a lot of space.
Et dans cet appareil, on trouve tout un.
And you can find absolutely a whole universe in that. And so we thought it would be interesting to imagine a future world where each mobile phone could become a library in your pocket, especially for youngsters who are getting a professional education or vocational education, and in countries where, for instance, in Arab-speaking countries or
Comment se développent les marchés numériques dans le domaine.
African countries who are not as fortunate as we are in accessing culture and reading.
Transformation
So, COVID crisis really taught us that a lot was going to change in terms of distance learning. And when it comes to the world of culture, of music, of videos, the crisis really accelerated the digital revolution,
Pensez à Netflix, évidemment.
and it brought on new giants, Netflix giants, and Canal Plus in France. And so the market basically is really transforming. I'm not going to give you
C'est aujourd'hui
a ton of figures, but
d'un marché de
I
140
wanted to talk about the book, the publishing industry. 144 billion euros market, and 95% of French books is published in France, when actually there are much more French speakers outside of France than inside of France. So the whole challenge is to find a simple solution to ensure that what's being published from all over the world in French can be accessible throughout the world easily. Some studies
sur le fait que
suggest that more than 50% of readers within the the next 10 to 15 years could be, digital readers, basically.
Locales en Afrique.
So how can YouScribe respond to these aspirations in Africa? So YouScribe, yes. Let's talk about Africa. There are about 320 million French speakers throughout the world, according to current statistics. There could be 700 million of them, of us. By 2050, 95% of
envie de
French speakers in the world will live in Africa then.
librairie
There are not many bookshops in
pays
many countries in Africa.
du Cameroun,
Cameroon, Congo, Burkina, or even in Côte d'Ivoire. There are actually very few libraries. So YouScribe, which is the digital library that I'm going to tell you more about in a moment, the idea is to find an easy, quick solution so that each learner, each student can, just with a mobile phone, have access to hundreds of thousands of books. What can you find in YouScribe? Hundreds of thousands of books on all subject matters, in French, in English, in Arabic, in other languages as well.
limité.
There's no limitation there. You can find great quantities of audio books because learning also happens via audio and oral means. And since it's a booming industry, you will find, learning books in many subject matters, mathematics, literature, comic books as well. So at a very reasonable cost, it gives access to everyone, to a whole library which often does not exist concretely in a great many of these countries.
As an example, we have about 15,000 public libraries in France, so that's one for 700 inhabitants. And in Africa, for historical reasons, it's one for 1.4 million inhabitants. So I think that digital solutions are the only way forward. Not just use Scribe, of course, but I think that's the only smooth solution, simple solution that we can have in the future to make sure that we open up access to knowledge to everyone. And I think that knowledge is the bedrock of getting an education, of moving up in life, and fighting poverty as well. Of course, you can imagine that young people, if they don't have access to education, would find a solution there through books. They can learn a trade and lift themselves out of poverty. In the higher northern regions of Canada, to take another examples, in the Inuit territories, you have this kind of issues. And recently, young people would have to move out of their birth region if they wanted to go and learn, basically. And satellites are a great option to give coverage, reception, basically, to everyone. And if you want to have this access to your library in your pocket, you need to have some network access at some point. After that, you can download things and then get offline and still have access to a number of things, but you still need to have access at some point, and we're working with satellite operators in a number of countries to solve that. You said you were working with Eutelsat. And maybe with Mr. Musk. Maybe one day. What is the economic model for Uscribe? How do you make money? That's important to your shareholders, I suppose. And this kind of subscription model that you have, it might be funded by national education ministries or high schools, etc. Well, it's important for shareholders, but also for content creators that we have a viable business model. In many countries, especially in Africa, since we are discussing Africa, many authors also don't have a lot of access to international markets. And through digital tools, then they can get some revenue, some income from their work. It's a leapfrog that makes it possible for those authors to also make a living from their knowledge. Anyway, we have 3 levers in this model. We have subscriptions from individuals, so that's easy enough to understand. Just think of your subscription to Spotify or Netflix. You're a single person, but you're going to sign up to Uscribe. For example, we have about 2 million subscribers. 95% of them are based in Africa, in 13 different countries in Africa, if I'm being precise. And it costs them about €2 a month. Because again, if you want to succeed, you need to adapt to the purchasing power of whoever you're talking to. And a single book can cost in France around €20. And of course, if you have this same price point, it's not going to work in Africa. So our aim is ready to have something that is compatible with everyone's purchasing power and everyone's device as well, from computers to smartphones. So that's the first option. Then we have a B2B model. We work with schools, universities, a number of institutions. I see some people in this room today who represent the kind of institutions we work with. They then buy dedicated access for their students.
Faire en sorte que chaque école
And that means that in every one of those schools, there is an offer for a plethora of books.
la chance, on a eu des bibliothèques dans toutes les écoles.
Most of us in this room today have studied in schools or universities where there was a library. But it's not true of everyone everywhere in the world.
Les entreprises
And
jouent un grand rôle pour autant qu'on leur offre une solution.
learning, whether it's academic learning or whether it's other kinds of learnings, it's important to have this access
Levier,
to knowledge, to books.
un modèle.
And I said 3 options. The third one is a partnership model,
Donc peut-être
partnerships with governments.
parmi vous pourraient se sentir concernés, qui sait.
Some of you might feel that it's relevant for you too. In the education world, the government is often called upon to find solutions to make sure that the youth
Toujours
in their country
à tous les
has access to knowledge.
des accords avec un certain nombre de
And that's why we have a number of agreements with governments, mostly African governments,
dans nos pays.
more than in Europe, where again there is a great coverage with both bookshops and libraries. But we have partnerships with
pour
governments in many countries in Africa
et puis pour donner du
to offer those solutions to the population. And I should also add that it's not just for knowledge or for learning purposes, because reading is also a tool of leisure and pleasure,
modèle,
of language learning, etc.
plus de 50% de nos revenus
So
sont
we have those 3 options, and more than 50% of our income flows through us to authors and writers.
Vous imaginez que ce modèle
Thank you very much for these
très intéressant.
these explanations.
Je crois que dès le départ, vous avez
I think that from the very beginning, you also wanted to offer self-publishing possibilities.
pays africain, vous allez nous dire, il y a déjà des
You're probably going to tell us that in African countries there are a number of authors who are already active and already have a readership. Yes, of course.
il y a peut-être des écrivains parmi vous,
There might be some writers in the room as well.
ou pas d'ailleurs.
I don't know.
J'ai rencontré tout à l'heure des professeurs.
il y a
Voilà.
Yes, I do see a few hands that shot up.
qui aiment être lus.
Well, writers like to be read, right?
Oui.
Yes, okay. I think we can assume that.
La question d'être lu, c'est une
And
question de diffusion, de distribution. Une fois que j'ai écrit,
you can't be read if you can't disseminate your writing. So there's always this question, how do I make sure that there is this access to what was already written? In most of our countries, there are publishing networks, huge printers,
milliards d'euros, voilà,
and it's a 5 billion euro sector,
parvient à diffuser de l'ordre de 400 millions de livres par an.
and about 400 million books a year in France.
On donne la chance
If you walk around the neighborhood, you will necessarily run into a bookstore at some point. And that's an opportunity for writers to actually live from their work. So it exists here, but it does not exist everywhere.
il y a pas toujours les librairies, il n'y a pas toujours le pouvoir d'achat.
Bookstores can
Euh,
be missing in some countries, but it can also be a simple matter of purchasing power. People don't have the money to put into books. And that's where YouScribe tries to make a difference.
YouScribe,
In YouScribe, if you look at the name, it's kind of half YouTube and half scribe.
savoir,
Scribe as a person who shares knowledge, but it's you as in self-publishing, you yourself.
ça ne veut pas dire spécialement imprimer un livre. Ça veut dire
And self-publishing does not necessarily have to mean printing out a physical book.
Le pouvoir de lecture
It's really just about disseminating that writing and giving everyone the possibility to do so.
publier à tous.
So it's not just about having the possibility to read, but also the possibility to disseminate your writing.
Solution simple où tout un chacun qui
We really try to empower readers as well as writers. And by writers, it can be an economics professor, a writer of fiction, a writer of young adult novels. Who cares?
on imagine
We just want to give this opportunity to empower all writers, all authors to publish.
c'est pas le sujet
And
de l'avenir, c'est comment
I don't think that's going to go through paper.
c'est une place
So YouScribe is really a platform, just like YouTube,
à tous ceux qui
that makes it
peut être un prof de français
possible
de
to share knowledge. Again, it could be a teacher, mathematics, French language, what do I know? Whoever they are, they then get this possibility
dans
to upload their work
le concept
and to let the whole world read it.
et la diffusion.
Meaning that you have a much bigger potential readership
Et c'est vrai.
anywhere in the world.
Là-dessus, j'espère que je suis pas trop long.
And I will wrap up with one more thing, which is that we discovered that there are a number of writers from Cameroon and the Congo, for example, who published on YouScribe novels mostly, many of them excellent works. And these books are among the ones that are most read on YouScribe.
Des romans et des textes
And it really struck us. Why is it that we have such a huge readership for authors from specifically those countries?
mais c'est simplement parce que ces autrices ont des réseaux
That's because those are authors who cultivate their social network. One of them has, for example, 172,000 followers on Instagram.
où les deux
A huge community.
donner la chance, je termine là-dessus, aux autrices et aux auteurs
So it makes sense to give those authors an opportunity to be read, since they already have an audience who wants to read them. We're giving them a simple solution that is affordable and that will get them where they should be.
Sur les livres audio,
Thank you. I have one more question on audiobooks.
ça peut se...
Since you distribute them, do you think that's going to develop a lot? The first audiobooks, we had them on mini tapes,
Pas choisir n'importe quoi.
so you would listen to them in the car.
Ça m'avait fait écouter
One of my sons
numéro
once
ça sur des films.
made me listen to philosophical lessons, but it's quite dangerous to try and drive and listen to philosophy at the same time.
je vois beaucoup de mains
I think there are many people here who listen to audiobooks, don't you?
qui se développent énormément.
Audiobooks are really gaining ground.
C'est un secteur qui était quasiment
The sector was all but non-existent
il y a 10-15 ans.
as a share of the market maybe 10, 15 years ago.
On revient toujours.
But again, we have now, those tiny computers in our pockets,
Qui
easy to carry around,
d'écouter des livres audio.
and making it possible and easy to listen to audiobooks everywhere. And now it makes up about 10 to 12% of the market.
On propose des dizaines de
And there are tens of thousands of them on YouScribe.
intéressants. Au-delà de ce que l'on propose, c'est de se dire
What's interesting to me is that,
solution
of course, there's this offer, but it's not just that. It's useful to have audiobooks while you're doing something else. You can listen to a great novel while making dinner.
d'être inspiré. C'est l'audio permet de faire autre chose.
Audiobooks give you new options.
L'audio, ça permet d'avoir accès aux connaissances.
It also gives you access to knowledge and to the use of the language that you're listening in, including if you find it difficult to read. There are some people who are not great readers, but they can be great listeners.
à Paris, mais beaucoup des collaborateurs de la société.
We're based in Paris, but we have a lot of our staff in Africa. And another thought I had was that AI will also make it possible to transform a lot of content into audio formats. Again, with this aim to make the use of the French language accessible to everyone, to people who don't have access to a bookstore or a library. Thank you very much.
Il y a peut-être un petit espace, je me tourne vers les
Thank you.
des questions.
I think we do have some time for questions.
De temps.
If there are, of course, questions in the room, I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
Oui, bonjour. Est-ce qu'on a un,
Hi.
on a un petit...
Do we have time? Do we have time for that?
5 minutes pour des
5 minutes, okay.
questions.
We have 5 minutes to take questions from the audience. We'd be delighted.
La première question peut venir des écrivains.
And we can get questions from our writers in the room, for example. Oh, we've got the gentleman over there.
La diffusion.
Yes, my question is about the diffusion of your strategy in Africa.
L'Afrique, avec sa forte.
Africa indeed has a huge birth rate compared to other geographies, and that means a huge demand for education.
Près que moins de 30%.
In some of our countries, less than 30% of the population, or as much as 30% of the population, is illiterate. And my question was, are you only targeting French-speaking countries or all of Africa, which would, of course, include English-speaking countries, Portuguese-speaking countries, and, of course, a number of other languages. Where are you from? Central African Republic. Okay. Thank you. Well, our vision will be, or is, I should say, to combat illiteracy, or at least to put tools at the disposal of populations to gain access to knowledge. And of course, our strategy is to develop in countries beyond the French-speaking world. English-speaking countries, but also Arabic-speaking countries. We're already present in South Africa. In Ghana, we'll open up our services to Nigeria as well.
Oui, il y a 215 millions.
A country with 215 million inhabitants.
D'ailleurs, le catalogue de YouScript.
And our catalogue, feel free to go and take a look at it. Our catalogue in English is just as well furnished as the French-speaking catalogue.
Il y avait une question par là.
We had another question over there.
Ah, oui, il vaut mieux pour les traductions.
Let's get them a mic.
Merci pour votre excellente présentation.
Thank you for your presentation. I am from the University of Paris North Sorbonne and also a UNESCO NGO
Tout ce qu'on appelle les ressources éducationnelles.
Active in open educational resources.
l'UNESCO. Alors ma question elle sera assez simple.
My question is quite simple.
Complètement ouverte, semi-ouverte.
What is your policy there in terms of openness of these publications?
Est vaste.
Well, it might be simple, but it's very broad, so I'm going to try and sum up my answer. A large part of our catalogue is free of charge. It is accessible free of charge.
Par exemple, si vous-même vous publiez un texte.
So if you decide that you want to publish something on YouScribe, you can decide to publish it for free.
C'est gratuit pour tous.
And of course, it's free of charge also for the writer.
La rémunération. Il
So you don't necessarily want to monetize it, and that's fine.
Des accords par lesquels
With governments, we have a number of agreements that make
gratuitement.
our resources, all of our resources, our whole catalogue, free of charge. But we can't have everything entirely free of charge because, of course, we also have to make sure that writers and content creators also make some money from their work, local content included. And that means creators in Africa as well. We don't want a top-down model where only the wealthy writing from Europe can afford to publish something.
C'est notre approche en tout cas.
So that's our approach at this point. We have time for one last question.
Merci. Je suis de la
Thank you. I come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, active in the legal field in particular.
on accède à votre
I wanted to know how we can get support from you, since you said that you wanted to support and empower. And I would like to know whether I can have your catalogue as well.
La demande émane du Congo.
Absolutely, I'm delighted
J'y étais encore il y a pas longtemps.
to hear that request.
Je vous accueille avec plaisir juste après.
And I would be very happy to talk to you right after the conference.
Vous travaillez dans le secteur public?
If you're active in the public sector in particular, I'm sure that we have a number of our solutions that can directly answer your expectations to support you and to support any public policies that target readers in any country, yours in particular, but any country.
Eh bien, on vous remercie beaucoup.
All right, thank you very much, everyone.
Je vois qu'on a switché en français.
I see that
En franglais. On a basculé vers...
we're now speaking French, but we'll also switch between French and English.
Our next session. Before our next session, I'd like to take a moment to thank our partners, Invest in Canada, Sagar, JTO Capital Markets, Jolt Capital, and CDPQ. We will dive into a new session. It is almost 4:30. We will discuss tripling renewables. And to discuss this large topic, please welcome Elima Croft. Elima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy, RBC Capital Markets.
What if there was a place where innovation was passed down as a legacy, where all the achievements of the past foreshadowed those of tomorrow? A place outside of time that was more alive than ever, one that would shine even brighter with your lights. What if there was a place where culture is so present that it also inspires your activity? A place celebrated both teamwork and individual accomplishments equally well. As conducive to the development of your business as it is to that of your children, where in addition to working, you would want to walk, enjoy, and live. What if there was a place to discover that already feels familiar to you? Look no further. This place exists, and you are already in. Paris region, you're in.
HEC Montréal, c'est là où se créent les possibilités de croître, d'exprimer son unicité, de faire les choses différemment, de faire des entreprises de véritables vecteurs de changement dans un monde durable. Nous sommes HEC Montréal, là où les possibilités se créent.
Where would one establish a production unit to claim a guarantee of security and quality of one's cosmetics, if not where the strictest controls on the planet are implemented? Where would one feel free to ignite its revolutionary creations, if not where imagination rules and decision makers and observers await them? some confronted the most demanding clients to test innovations, if not where customers have ever been so demanding. Where would one look for the most responsible and creative talents, if not where they are born, raised and educated, in the midst of an environmentally conscious, daring ecosystem? Where would one test one's creation, its texture, its durability, its inclusivity, if not in the historical and forever capital of love, elegance and wit? Where else?
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this session on the challenge of tripling renewable capacity by 2030. I'm Halima Croft, Managing Director and Global Head of Commodity Strategy at RBC Capital Markets. I have an all-star panel with us today to discuss this challenge. And I'm going to put a question to all of my panelists. I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves and talk about the role their company is playing in meeting this challenge. So my question to everyone is, COP28 laid out the ambitious goal of tripling renewable capacity by 2030. We just completed COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, which was dubbed the Finance COP. And the question is, as we think about this, for all of my panelists, where are we in meeting this goal if we level set expectations? What is the biggest challenge? Is it finance, as COP29 laid out? Is it infrastructure? Is it government policy? Is it breakthrough technology? So just to give us a sense of where we are on this, I'm going to turn to our panelists. And again, introduce yourself and talk a bit about the role your company is playing in this challenge.
So I'm Svein Holseter. I'm the CEO of Yara International. We're one of the largest fertilizer companies in the world, and we're going straight into the food sector. And food is energy, and it takes energy to produce food. And the product that we produce is responsible for feeding half of the world's population. But it's very energy intensive. So we need all forms of energy, including renewable. And as you say, new targets have been set on renewable. It's still a very small part of the energy mix, so it's important that we have ambitious targets. Is it happening fast enough? No, I don't think so. And it depends a bit on where in the world you are when it comes to what the main problems are. So I'm going to focus mainly on Europe. And this should really have been Europe's time. We have a fairly large share compared to the rest of the world of renewable energy in the mix prior to the energy crisis. And just at a time when we should have accelerated that, we're not doing that. And the reality right now is that more than half of the renewable or new renewable energy is being installed in China, which is good. But what are we doing in Europe? And here, I think it's important to think about regulation. It takes much too long time to get permits in place. 7 to 10 years is not uncommon. And we're in 2025, so where are we going to be at in 2030 with that kind of speed? But it's also competitiveness and green premiums, and how do you get incentives in place to really drive this at scale. And that's not something that we can do alone from the private sector. It has to be done together with governments as well.
Dominique?
Yes, good morning, everyone. So Terega, it's a small company. We operate infrastructure in the southwest of France. But when we speak about what is our involvement in tripling this objective of renewable energy, what we do is to help locally the regional governments and the companies look at what their strengths and what really exists locally. Because in fact, tripling renewable energy will mean exploiting as much as possible what you have around you, instead of trying to use energies that are coming from far away, etc. So the first element we had around our network was, and it was pushed by the French government, but it's important that we help all the companies that want to develop, for example, biomethane in the region. It's complementary to what the agricultures or the farmers are doing, so it will bring additional money, etc. And I think on that we are on track. But it's not only our wish, it's really organized in France from the central government to the regions, to the farmers. They know each of one what will be the interest of each of them. So it could be used as an example. So tripling the production of biomethane by 2030 will be done. For the other, of course, there are plenty of other resources. We can increase the number of solar panels. We can increase the wind farms or the offshore wind farms, etc. It's more difficult. So just as I told you before, it's easy to come from zero to something which is triple for zero. It's zero. Now we will increase, but it will take a longer time. And my main message, it's really, as you said, around the demand. So how to implement rules that will help the demand to come, and how to develop a sort of pragmatisms that will bring us step by step to the right direction instead of thinking immediately to what is the end result that is not achievable. From our side, so what we propose to the companies and the region is to organize the logistic of what could be an industrialized energy sector, which is decarbonized. When it will be developed, I don't know exactly, but we will develop it step by step from the east to the west, looking at the geography. But it's what we do to try to be on the ship in order to be at the rendezvous at the end.
Fantastic. And Gwenelle?
Yes, thank you very much. So on my side, I'm leading European operations for a company that is called Schneider Electric. So the company has been nominated as the first sustainable company in the world by the Time magazine, and that's how we define our purpose and the content of the company. So we are very much enabler of the energy transition through electrification, but also through digitalization. And I think we will talk a lot about software too. But so basically that's who we are. And when it comes to the COP and where we stand so far, well, there is on one side all the renewable energy that we need and all the discussion we're having, and there is also something that is behind the scene. What's behind the scene is that everything that we do not talk. In COP, in all the European discussion, we have lots of targets. We have targets on renewable energy. We have targets on greenhouse gas emissions. We have targets on energy efficiency. And the question is that now we should be back to reality. We are very far from achieving those targets. And that's what kind of discussion we need to have. And to develop this discussion, we need also to think what kind of other technology do we need. For example, one technology that is required is around grid, digitalization of the grid development. We need to have this discussion because if we have renewable energy coming online, but we are not able to adjust the renewable energy to come into the network, then we have a big problem. So the question in those discussions is beyond having new commitments, how to make sure that what we have been committed is exactly delivered. And I will give you just a few numbers. Renewable energy today in Europe, we are developing on wind 17 gigawatt a year. In order to fulfill our commitment by 2030, we should develop 30 gigawatt. So instead of defining new targets for 2040, first we need to make sure that we realize our commitment to 2030. And these scopes where we try to again have new pledges, no commitment, because for politicians, it's good to have numbers, but it's better to realize that. And the question for all this industry in this panel is how to make sure that collectively we realize the targets that we have been committed to. So this is my first element, wake-up call on realizing our commitment. And the second one that we don't talk is skills. In order to fulfill this energy transition, we need to skill. We need to reskill our employees. We need to make sure that we have a path towards this energy transition to happen. I can tell you now to find good electricians, super complex. And I can tell you by 2030, we need 1 million additional workers on solar. We need to reskill 18 million new people in Europe for the energy transition. How to make that happen? I don't bet only on the public sector. We need also all the companies to commit on skill and reskilling. So that's my second point.
And Laura?
So Anne-Laure de Chamard, I'm working for Siemens Energy, which is an energy technology company. We have 1/6 of the electricity produced in the world that comes from our technologies. And we're doing wind, gas turbines, grid technologies, green hydrogen technologies, etc. And I mean, a lot has been said on the need for financing, permitting, regulation, skills, etc. I'm really very aligned with what Gwenaëlle just said. We are extremely late in this whole thing about tripling renewables. It took us 40 years, for example, if you take the wind industry, to get to 1 terawatt. And we now have 6 more years to build 2 more terawatts. So the acceleration is huge. And it's not just about building renewables. The whole big, huge bottleneck that we see is the grid. Today, you have more than 3,000 gigawatt of renewables that is built, existing, but in limbo because you don't have the grid to connect the source of generation to the demand. Huge waste of money, and this is actually where we need to accelerate even more to make it happen. This means approximately 25 million kilometers of grid that need to be built, 30% of the existing infrastructure, and for that, you need faster permitting, simplification. We need to stop the micromanagement and to actually accelerate on this topic from governments everywhere in the world.
Fantastic. So much in those opening statements. I want to pick up on 3 themes. We've discussed Europe in depth. Can we have any thoughts about how we think about how various regions stack up against each other? So we've talked about China and China moving ahead. How should we be thinking about the Americas? And how should we be thinking about Sub-Saharan Africa and meeting this challenge? Sven, I'm going to put you on the hot seat.
Yeah, I could start with the U.S. and the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's something that has been spoken a lot about, and I think it serves as an inspiration, really, because at the end of the day, the Paris Agreement, and I was here in Paris in December 2015, so I saw what happened there, but huge commitments on reducing emissions, but they are politically decided. The country commitments are politically decided as well. And by the way, to be clear, I'm 100% in support of that. It's necessary in order to deal with emissions and the impact to climate. But just because it's politically decided doesn't mean that it happens by itself. As businesses, we are set up and we're quite good at responding to demand with supply. And today there is no global CO2 tax. So if you're making the investment, and it is an investment, especially if you're a first mover, and there's no premium or there's no payback for it, it's better to sit and wait for someone else to do it, and then we're not going to be able to make this transition. The US has understood this, that you need to do this jointly. There has to be some sort of incentive to reduce emissions, because at the end of the day, if there are no incentives and it doesn't happen, well, who pays for it? It's society, it's the global population. So why not start now and get a head start and reduce the emissions and do that together with business so that you create an enabling environment and you incentivize the first movers. While in Europe we have the more you pay for emissions, and when you're coupling that with high energy prices and businesses under pressure, it's simply too big a task to ask at this moment. So I think looking at the US, thinking about this as a business opportunity and also putting money into and thinking of this as an investment to avoid a climate catastrophe.
I'm going to ask a really quick follow-up on that because you talked so much about the Inflation Reduction Act. Do you have any concerns, as you highlighted as a model, with the change in Washington about the potentially scaling back of that?
But look what's happening. Yeah. I mean, massive investments are going into the US. This is a big success. They're attracting industries. They're building out. Of course, there will always be uncertainties. But I think what we're seeing is investments being driven, and it makes sense. So I'm still strong believer in the Inflation Reduction Act and what that will mean for the U.S. economy and also securing critical infrastructure, the kind of industries that you would like to have regional sovereignty on. And again, that's a message to Europe.
Dominique?
Yes, I just wanted to push in the same direction. I think maybe in Europe, what globally we have not fully understood is that it's a major change that we are living today. It's not just the evolution of the former existing system that we push with one additional interconnection there and there. We are changing the route. And to change the route, there is either to push the demand or to push the offer. The Chinese, they push the products. So they develop the technology, and when the technology will be there, in any case, they will find customers, even if in the middle there is a gap in between, that they will find us. On the other hand, you have the Americans, and they push giving incentives to the one that suppress or decreases the amount of CO2 which is produced. It's a very simple rule just to apply. You launch your project, you know what you will earn, so you will find the finance. If you have the technology, will you get it? In Europe, you have slices of measures with some subsidies just to develop the technology. And if your technology is ready, unfortunately, there is another subsidy that was given to another part that is not ready, as you said. So, and what? Because we have completely split slices. So it looks like a Europe, a global Europe, but we need real operational Europe today, not just political things.
And maybe to add on to that, Dominic, what we also need is visibility, certainty. The topic is not about what type of regulation you have. The topic is how certain you are as a company, as an industry, that it's actually going to be applied long term. And what we saw actually with the IRA is that as soon as you had additionality clauses that were put in, etc., with all the uncertainty of the elections, a lot of things were kind of stalled, every project stopped. I'm taking the example of hydrogen. Huge announcements. We were talking about gigawatts to invest in the US of projects that were going to happen in green hydrogen. Then they started talking about not just incentives, but starting to slice. So saying like, oh, it should be, connected to a certain grid. And by the way, you should produce hydrogen only when you produce at the same time renewable electricity on top. And by the way, you should be able to prove X, Y, Z. So starting to make it the European way. Everybody stopped investing and said, I'm going to wait and see. And this is also what is happening currently with the hydrogen auctions in Europe as well. So for me, visibility is super important.
So if I may, I think that we should draw lessons. There is no one model that is working well rather than the others. In Europe, we have taken a leadership on energy transition. We were the first one having a carbon market. We are the first one having targets. So there is nothing, we cannot say that we threw everything on the bin. It's not correct. Yes, we have some good grounded. The question is how to make sure that we keep this leadership, because over time we are losing it. We are losing because we are in a worldwide competition. China is going extremely fast. The US, they are much more carrot than stick, and we are stick and not carrot. That's the biggest problem that we have. So the question is how to remain consistent and to make sure that we gain this leadership over time, and that on the other hand, the other are not catching up. And I'm saying that because the US, they are very pragmatic. If there is good business, they will go for it. And right now, they are going for renewable energy because it's good business. The day it will change, they will change. So it's very simple, very pragmatic. In Europe, we wanted to do green hydrogen for the past 5 years. And now everybody is suddenly, maybe it will be a technology for 2030, 2035. And maybe people are starting to be scared. And they want to redirect already funds to something else. How can we not sticking to one technology that could really make a difference over time in the worldwide competition? No, we are changing gears every 2 minutes. Another example, we wanted to develop battery for sovereignty, because sovereignty of Europe is important. So we wanted to develop battery manufacturing in Europe. Guess what? Northvolt, Verkor, they're in a difficult situation right now. So how do we maintain leadership over time? We need to invest much more into R&D. R&D intensity in Europe is much lower than the US or China. So we need to stick and to have much more funded into R&D. We need to skill people, and we need to stick to our battles and not change gears every 2 minutes.
I want to pick up a theme that you mentioned on AI. How impactful will AI and machine learning be in meeting these goals, and what more needs to be done to ensure that we can scale this up?
Well, it's a good question on AI. Today, there are different conversations that could take place. On one hand, people may think about data center as a way to consume more energy and then impacting the grid. So that's one way to think about it. And of course, we need to think about it because it can be quite impactful. So we need to anticipate all that and preempt the debate. I give you a few examples. In Ireland, today, data centers are consuming almost 25% of the energy. So it's quite significant. So yes, data centers will continue to evolve and to scale because of cloud and then generative AI. Should we fight against it because of the impact on the energy? No, but we should make it sustainable. So that's why we are working with various data centers company in order to help them decarbonize and making sure they limit the impact into the grid. One example, we've been working with Green Mountain, and they are developing the first data center that is net zero. That's something like that we need in order to fulfill our commitment into net zero decarbonization, and at the same time, don't fight against technology. We need AI. Why do we need AI? Because the energy transition is a dual transition. It's energy and digitalization both at the same time. Here around the table, we're talking a lot about renewable energy, hydrogen, and all that, which is super good. But to realize the 1.5 degree scenario, half of the effort is the demand, working on the demand, energy efficiency. And to make sure that we fulfill energy efficiency, we need digitalization. That's why we need to work on data center of the future, limiting to impact on water, on heat, on energy, and at the same time, working on data center in order to make us better in the energy transition, accelerate the energy transition. And sometimes when you think about it, people think, oh, maybe it's very small in the impact of the energy transition. No, it can be very big, on the contrary. You just take one building, you use all the data that you can have in a building, it's hundreds of thousands of data real time that you can capture, and based on AI, you can reduce the consumption by 30%. 30% with ROI, return on investment, of less than 5 years. So this is the reality of the energy transition. It's a dual transition. Energy and digital, we need both hand in hand, but we need to make it happen in the right way.
And maybe on this, to add to what Gwenaëlle was saying, it is something where you do need a real coordinated push. Because as you were saying, data centers, AI is going to create a lot of energy demand. The analysis are showing that the data centers that will have to be built between now and 2030 for generative AI is going to consume the equivalent power of 200 new nuclear plants. This means building, in the next 5 years, 200 nuclear plants. So if we don't do it the right way, in a sustainable way, it is not at all going to help us go into the right direction. And we actually see this already in the US. A lot of the big, Microsoft, Meta, etc., we're talking about accessing renewable energy. Currently, the demand for energy and for data centers is so high, accelerating so fast, that it's just about having access to energy. And so we see a big push now on gas power plants in the US because of that. So it's really something where, as Gwenaëlle was saying, working on energy efficiency to reduce the demand, and at the same time, seeing how we can push together, coordinate this push for energy from AI in a way that is sustainable is key.
I love the bringing in the conversation about natural gas, because one of the things that I think we're all struggling to think about is what is going to be the role of oil, natural gas, the traditional fossil fuels as we think about the AI revolution, as we think about energy transition. So, Dominique, your perspective on gas, what is the role of gas?
Yeah, I used to say that during at a certain period in time that gas was a good solution for the transition. It's what I said when I said, in fact, that we still need to be pragmatic. So we cannot make the transition without gas. Gas should be used. It should, at an evidence, it should be properly managed and properly used for the purposes where it's very vital to use it. In terms of energy efficiency, it should be the first energy on which we put the AI system and all the system in order to reduce the consumption. And it's exactly what we've made at Teréga. So we have put a digital system on all the delivery system that we supply for our customers in order for them to get the information that is vital for them. They had not that before. Today they have the information in order to reduce that. And we have seen the shift already. So from 2019 to 2022 in France, the consumption of gas went from 470 terawatt hour to less than 400. So you have a sharp decrease, and this decrease will continue. In parallel, of course, should be greener, this gas. So it will be a mix of the gas that you can produce through the biology, let's say the biogas that you will produce from waste, etc. But you will need, in any case, for a certain period of time, for the industry that wants or uses a big quantity of gas, they will need to have the certainty of the gas being produced and sent. But little by little, and is a scenario that we have in France, in 2040, typically the consumption will be close to 200 terawatt hour, which is half of what we have today. So, but don't say that it will not be used, because at the end, these are the final consumer that will not use it. And in parallel, we develop also the capture of the CO2 that could be emitted. So all of that is complementary, should be economic, but I see still gas being there in 2040 with, let's say, an average consumption level which is half what we have today, but it will still be necessary.
And that's probably just for Europe.
Yeah.
Because
Yes,
for the rest of the
course,
world,
yeah.
gas will grow big time. The idea is to replace oil, to replace coal. We all know that gas is consuming 50% less, emitting 50% less of CO2 than coal. And there's a lot of countries that are still heavily dependent on coal, and their energy transition will go through gas as a transition.
Sven, your thoughts? And the perspective from Norway.
Yeah, and you know, the problem right now isn't too much gas; it's too little renewable. So we need to try to do several things at the same time. One, we need to scale up renewable energy much faster, and then think about reducing other sources of energy. And we start with coal. I mean, we're still using coal, so we should get rid of that long before.
Consumption's actually increasing.
It is, and that's something we need to keep in mind. And we've tried now, or we've seen the impact in Europe. What happens if you're disconnecting an important energy source like gas? What happened after Russia's invasion of Ukraine? What that does to energy prices for households and for industries. So that's the consequence of abrupt shutdown of natural gas. It still has an important role to play. It is possible to put in place technologies. In fact, we're doing it in our company right now with carbon capture and storage in the Netherlands, where we will capture 800,000 tons of CO2 from 2026, and it will be transported to the Norwegian continental shelf, Northern Lights, with Total Energies and Shell and Equinor. And this is possible, but then we also need stronger incentives and also better regulation. And just an interesting fact here, when in our plant in the Netherlands, it's at the border of Belgium. And you know, when you produce, you have CO2, it crosses the borders quite quickly. The moment you capture it and transport it, that's not straightforward. So here, great work by the governments in Netherlands and Norway to put that in place, but it wasn't straightforward. But it shows that it's possible. But if I compare again Europe to the US, we're paying for that. We're taking the market risk for doing that. While if that plant had been in the US with the 45Q in Inflation Reduction Act, we would have income as a result of that. So technologies are here, but in order to get it to scale, we need to have structures that actually help to pay for it.
I want to pick up, you mentioned the energy crisis in Europe, and Norway played an important role with boosting gas to Europe. How are we now in terms of the potential for, are you concerned about winter? I mean, it's supposed to be a cold winter in Europe. We're marking soon the third anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How are we thinking about sort of Europe's energy security as we head into winter?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Europe has done a tremendous job adapting to a very, very challenging situation and have been able to get through it somehow, but it has come at a very high cost for households. Look at industries, shutdowns of vital industries moving outside Europe as well. And still, we're at an energy cost way higher than China or the US, and it was highlighted in the Draghi report as well. I think 150% higher for electricity, 350% higher for gas. And that has an impact. From a Norwegian perspective, it's an energy nation, and I'm quite proud of what the Norwegian oil and gas industry did in order to increase production at a time of need. But still, that's not enough to compensate. And here we need more import capacity in Europe. We need to have a more enabling environment to drive that, because right now Europe is at a disadvantage. We've been able to get through, and even now, in December 2024, the major uncertainty, whether we have enough energy or not, is weather. And that's quite frightening because we can't control that.
Dominique?
Yeah, just nothing to add on that, except that, in fact, the structure, the architecture of the gas system in Europe is very strong. So it doesn't mean it's the same for everywhere in the world, but in Europe, using the LNG terminal, the gas coming from Norway, the gas coming from the south, etc. The storages, which are very full at the time, are still, even if it's the beginning of the winter period. So the architecture makes us rather reliable and sustainable if a strong winter comes or not. We have margins in the system if LNG arrives. So it poses the questions on where does LNG goes and what are the conditions, the weather conditions outside of Europe.
Fantastic.
Maybe I will add one point, because we talk a lot about gas, but I think the real challenge that we have in Europe is to accelerate electrification. Today in Europe, we are electrified by only 24%, and we are stagnant for the past 10 years. This is the reality. So we talk a lot about renewable energy, etc. The reality is that we are stuck in electrification. China is growing electrification 9 times more than us. So what's the recipe? What's the question behind? I think that we need to speak the truth. The situation is electrification is not happening as fast as we should. And in the different segments, it's not just one segment. Of course, mobility is accelerating on electrification. But there are many other segments. The building segment on one side, with the development of heat pump, for example. But there is also the industrial segment. And the industry, only 20% of the industry in Europe is electrified. Only 20%. We should go up to 50%. It sounds easy, but we have to go side by side, segment by segment of the industry to see what's possible. But 50% is possible. So the message is that we need to rethink our relationship with electrification, because today we are very much stagnant. We need to accelerate this path, and this will help a lot. And the second element is that last year, because of the situation, the crisis, there was an electricity market design reform, which is positive, right? But the question is that certain measures are only applicable in urgent condition. Give you one example, curtailment. If there is a high demand, it's only applicable if there is a big urgency. Shouldn't we rethink our electricity model so demand side is fully integrated into our electricity market design? I would really challenge this one. Otherwise, we don't really have demand side embedded into electricity market design.
No, I mean, maybe just to add also, because we were talking about resilience due to the price of gas, due to the electrification, I think there's a key element which is also technologies. Today, we are heavily dependent on a few countries for certain technologies. If you take solar PV, it's China. If you take batteries, same thing. You were talking just before about the battery industry not being well in Europe. I think there we also need to be much more coordinated in Europe in the way we deal with the energy transition. We are creating 27 small, tiny champions on small, tiny markets in Europe. When in the US and in China, you're creating huge champions on very large markets that are the size of the whole of Europe. If we don't start in Europe thinking about it at a global, regional, geographical way, we will never be able to scale in a competitive way to be able to be resilient on our technologies.
Can I ask a follow-up on that, because it's such an important question? Is it a policy change? Is there, can you name like the most important policy to create the sort of champions in Europe that you need to compete with China and the United States?
I think it is indeed about, having at the European level a strong will and a strong, maybe policy where all the 27 member countries actually agree on the fact that we need to favor European champions and we need to stop having our nationalist little champions that are competing against each other. This is literally what is happening today. The second point is also that we are probably a bit naive in Europe. When you look at all the different regulatory constraints that we have on the European industry, and for good reasons, for values that we want to promote, which are, cybersecurity, labor law, energy transition, etc., CSRD, etc. We are putting all these constraints on the European industry and on the European technologies, but at the same time, when we're actually doing a public tender, and, for example, a Chinese technology is competing, we're not asking for the same constraints. And we're just saying, we're going to take the cheapest. And if you're not cheap enough, then it's your problem. This is very naive. We are saying that we want to, follow the WTO rules, but at some point, if we're not asking everybody to play on a level playing field, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. And this is really the Draghi report. It's about making sure that we don't become just a demand market because we want to make sure that we're not, that we're opening our borders with maybe competitors that don't have the same conditions.
And maybe this is a very important point, because the good example of what you are saying is that the European Commission has presented a Net Zero Industrial Act that is supposed to ask for local preference in public tender, exactly what you say. And we are still waiting for the rules, the detailed rules, how to applicable that. And in the US, they are so quick. When decisions are made, it's immediate. Whereas in Europe, we are still thinking a year after how to implement that. How is that possible? So local preference, public tenders, Net Zero Industrial Act, and this year we'll talk about the Clean Industrial Deal. This should be part of the discussion. You're absolutely right.
Dominique?
Oh, I'm fully in line with what I've said. What is the most important for us is to count the number of new projects entering into service. It's vital. And in fact, the more projects you will have in all this energy transition aligned with the objectives, the more you will have an industry behind that. And today, it does not exist really. It's players.
I can give a concrete example. And actually here, also with the grid in France. If you don't have visibility on the projects, you don't have the industry, the manufacturing industry behind to actually build the products that you need. If you take the grid, transformers, when you want to build a grid network, you need 6 to 7 years of waiting time in the factories because there's such a queue that is building up. So if you start saying, I'm actually going to shift my projects, I don't know if I'm going to do it, oh, and by the way, I want my project then in 3 years, it is never going to happen. So the more long-term visibility you give, the more you will able to have the full supply chain and the full industry work to be able to deploy that.
And maybe it's a joke, but we spoke about the role of AI in the energy transition. One of my wish is that the European Commission, because we are speaking a lot of the EU here, we are in France, of course, but is that they use the AI tool in order to properly understand what does not work. It's easy just to ask the system what does not work, and mainly the things which does not work. These are legal regulations, local legal regulations. These are the fact that the projects, let's say, do not work properly, the one next to the other, etc. And not asking us what we should do in order to develop. We are ready to develop. We are committed to develop. We have the money and we can reach the money if we have the proper regulation, a continuous view of what should be done. The technology is ready, and a step-by-step approach, meaning that when there is a solution that works, we implement it quickly.
Yeah, and just speaking on behalf of the hard-to-abate sector, and we're one of those, producing fertilizer, and we've already done a lot to reduce our emissions. I think we're down approximately 50% compared to 2005. But the next step now, in order to get that done, is new technology. It's about electrification, and I think that cuts across a number of industries. You need more electricity and generation of electricity, but not only that, it needs to be affordable and it needs to be available as well. And in order to do that and also have electricity available for data center, we need a massive build out of new power generation across Europe. And then one part, and we touched upon, is the regulatory part of it, but it's also public acceptance of it. I think everyone wants renewable energy until it shows up in your backyard. The NIMBY effect is also an important part here. And at the end of the day, politicians are also responding to voters, right? So it's creating the awareness of the importance of electricity also here in Europe, and how that supports the societies as we know it, but also livelihoods, tax income, and critical infrastructure.
And since this is a global challenge, Sven, I wonder if you could also talk about like the challenge in places like India and sub-Saharan Africa, where affordability and access are such critical issues for them.
Indeed, and I think it's we have to be. It has to be a just transition as well, so that we don't apply completely different rules in the development of whether it's in India or sub-Saharan Africa. That they need to evolve as well, and to the extent that they cannot take the same path that we did, well then, I think it's part of our responsibility to also help to incentivize that, and making, well, one, technology is available, but also helping to with incentives in order to make it both affordable but also sustainable. So it's a challenge also to us here in Europe. We have benefited and we've created industries. Well, then we also have a responsibility to support other parts of the world.
And Laura?
Oh, and it's also actually just a good way to optimize the investment and the money that we have at a global scale. The cost of actually doing the last mile of decarbonization in Europe, which is in reality tiny compared to the emissions of the whole world, is huge. If you take the same amount of money to actually do the first steps of shifting from coal to gas, of China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa, the impact of the same dollar is 10 times bigger. So probably also at a global level, when you think about the cost of the energy transition, we should probably start by that rather than the last mile of the European decarbonization.
And maybe one thing, many people in Africa or even in India, they don't have access to energy. So it's not even a question of coal or gas. They don't have access to energy. The day they will have access, they will rely on the existing power. So I think it's also our responsibility to give access to these populations that are far away by giving access to energy that would be sustainable. So that's why we have in Schneider Electric developed technologies dedicated for rural areas, for villages, etc., so that those people that almost automatically transition into solar plus batteries and things like that, so they don't go towards the curve from coal to gas to renewable energy, but directly into the end game situation. And that should be also our fight, gaining access to this population. We have taken a commitment on that front to reach 50 million people that we will grant access to energy thanks to our technologies in 5 years, 2021 up to 2025, so almost 5 years, and we have already reached the target, 50 million people. So it means that if we collectively as big companies take also this kind of commitment, because socially, because in purpose it's important, I think that we can make meaningful impact, right?
Dominique?
No, I'm just saying, yes, she's right.
Okay, well, I'm actually going to pick up on one more theme before we close the session out. China has come up on multiple occasions. Supply chain issues around China. As we look out to 2025, how concerned are you about the potential impact of a trade war? What would that mean for access to the technology coming from China, cost of the technology coming from China? How does it rank in terms of your 2025 things to watch list?
Maybe I can start as a technology company investing also in China. So first of all, I mean, we will have to continue to count on China. Today, as we said, 95% of the solar PV comes from there. Wind technologies are also there. Battery technologies also come from there. They have a huge control of also all the metal and mining and all the rare metals for the energy transition. So
processing.
And the processing of it. So it's extremely important that we also maintain this relationship with China to be able to drive the energy transition at the right pace. At the same time, this should not be used as a trade fair weapon either. And so this is also why it is our global responsibility to diversify our supply chain. And a lot of technology companies are saying, I'm continuing to invest in China. And by the way, we're investing a lot in China for the Chinese market, because the market per se is already huge. It's the equivalent of the European market anyhow. But we're also investing in third countries like India, like Africa, Middle East, to be able to diversify a supply chain and respond, as you said, to potential risks, geopolitical risks that we might have.
The China question, Sven?
Yeah, I've been to China a couple of times in the last few months, and that was my first trip back after COVID, and I've been quite amazed about the speed of progress on sustainability and how that has been embedded also into agriculture. And I've seen some really advanced use of digital tools, of drones for precision farming, and so it's moving at a rapid pace. So I think we have a lot to learn when it comes to ability to execute and to get things done at scale from China. I think I mentioned that the 55% of the new renewable energy capacity was installed in China in 2023. And let's also reflect on how important China has been to reduce the cost of renewable energy across the world on the solar side and what they've done there. So I think we need to look to China for support in scaling up. And when it comes to trade, I think level playing field is important. That was also a very important part of the Draghi report. And that's not only about China, it's about the rest of the world and where we need to be realistic about this as well. But on scale and commitment to sustainability, I've been quite impressed by what I've seen in China.
Dominique, thoughts on China?
In fact, it's a very difficult question, but my fear is that today, in the challenges between the big, I would say, the big ones, the US, China, I do not see Europe as being big. It's a big market, but if we are strong, it's another question. But there is a fight there, and as long as there is a fight, there will be tools that will be used in order to make one win, or let's say be stronger in one direction or another. As we are here in the OECD, we are not the OECD, but I have a message to pass to the OECD. They have on the CO2 tax a very strong role to play, because this is the only forum today where they can try to mitigate what is a little bit too wide in one direction in order to allow, let's say, differences or different regulations to be put in various areas, but with a sort of harmonization by measuring what the impact it brings to. So my wish, and I know it will be difficult with the Trump administration because they will speak bilaterally, is that next to the bilateral discussion, there are this multilateral discussion that will allow everybody to be inclusive in these questions. Because at the end, you may win in China or may win in the US, but at what price for the others?
We only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to do another sort of forward-leaning question to close us out. We're talking after COP29. Next year is a big COP. It's COP30 in Brazil. What do you think we will be talking about this time next year? Will it be the same discussion? Will we've made progress on some of these core issues? What do you hope we'll talk about next year? So Gwenaëlle, take us forward to 1 year from now. We're all back from Brazil. What will be on the agenda?
Well, first, it will be the anniversary since the COP in Paris, right? So we were there together with colleagues here, and then it will be the reunion. Are we in or are we not? So I think this should be the real debate. And for that, in the text of UNFCCC, the countries should come back before the COP by saying, I'm on target, I want to revisit my targets, etc. So it will be all around, are we really decisive in achieving the Paris Agreement that we all voted for? And therefore, maybe it's back to reality. I don't blame, having this kind of discussion. On the contrary, it can be positive because it could emphasize where we have to work on. If we are blind and we are saying everything is fantastic, we are in line with the Paris Agreement, this is where we could fail. So that's why having this realistic scenario and realistic discussion after, Paris, where do we stand? Is it realistic? What have we done right? What have we done wrong? It would be very enthusiastic. Now, I think that around those debates, we also need to work more around adaptation, because in everything that we said, we were very much focused on attenuation, how to reduce our own emission. The question is, when you are seeing all those extreme events across the world, we need to rethink how we build our infrastructure. Infrastructure needs to be built in a way that is much more resilient towards extreme events. So adaptation will more and more be on the front scene, because it will touch many people across the world. In Europe, we have had, since the beginning of the year, 80% more extreme events than last year. Flood and things like that in Italy, in Spain, etc. So it's becoming big. So adaptation will be more and more important. And the second area for my part that will be more important is the youth. We don't talk about the youth, but so many young generation are committed on those topics. We have no right to fail. We need to embark them in this energy transition, reskill them, make them part of this discussion. So for me, this is the new topic beyond everything that we've discussed around technology, etc., that will have to be on the debate.
Fantastic. And Laura, we're running out of time. Final thoughts?
No, I would say maybe three things that we need to focus on going forward. It's simplification. We need to simplify permitting and the way we actually want to drive this energy transition from the governments. I would say then offtake, creating the offtake so that you have the right business case, because as many of us said, if you don't have the business case, it will never happen. And so creating the right offtake, it can be CO2, pricing, it can be, but creating the offtake, which is global, is super important. And the third one is financing. And there I'm talking financing to de-risk new technologies in maybe developed countries, and financing to support developing countries in their access to energy and their energy transition.
Fantastic. Dominique, we're here same time next year, post-Brazil.
No, I have really nothing to add to what has been said, and in particular to making let's say, looking at what happens since the start of.
Are you optimistic then?
No.
For the next 12 months that we will make progress?
No, if they do the job properly, we will arrive to the conclusion that we have not met our targets, so that we should find something else. And the something else is probably that we should think differently. Instead of thinking the former model, we should think, let's say, a new model. In order to achieve the target that we want by 2050, we need to change the way the world works. And it's why I'm speaking about decompressing globalization. It doesn't mean no globalization, it's globalization. But we should thinking differently. And for that, it needs to have back to the nations and the territories. We will have carbon as much as we can produce in the atmosphere, as long as we do not use locally what is produced locally. So there is a way to reorganize the world, and it's my dream, maybe for 2050, in order to use as much as possible the technologies that will be necessary or useful to decarbonize, but at the same time reorganize production, reorganize the way circular economy is understood.
You have the final word, Sven.
So there's nowhere to hide now. We're going to be in 2025 next year, 5 years left to 2030, and commitments that were perhaps easy to make in 2015, when it's 15 years into the future. Now it's coming very fast, and a lot of these commitments need to be made now, whether it's politically or in businesses. In businesses, they need to be made in the boardroom this year and next year. So that's one wish, that we really embed and understand what it takes from us, each and everyone individually, in order to get there. And if we don't know, well, then we need to do something radically different. And second, Brazil is a food superpower. And I hope that we can get food, agriculture, food systems sufficiently on the agenda, and that we start to work with farmers, help farmers, incentivize farmers, rather than putting additional burdens on the shoulders of the farmers. They play an important role in enabling this transition, yet we're not treating them the way they should be treated.
That's a fantastic note to end on. My dream would be to reassemble this panel to hear our thoughts 1 year from now. But until then, I will hand over closing comments to my amazing colleague, Eric Meyer, CEO of RBC Capital Markets in France. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Elima, and thank you for your outstanding panelists as well. What an invigorating, but a tough one, and thought-provoking discussion. So really, as you said, I'm in charge of RBC here, and really energy transition is at the very heart of our actions and engagement. And, you know, as you just all said, we simply have no choice but to charge ahead. And this panel demonstrates one thing, that smart people, driven organizations, and the adequate financing, as just mentioned, can together make things happen. So a big thank you again, and a well-deserved round of applause for this panel, please.
Thank you all for this great discussion. In conclusion, laissez-moi mettre un nom peut-être sur nos...
I will remind you who our speakers were.
We had Swain Torre Olseter, President and CEO of Yara International, Dominique Maucly, Chairman and CEO of Terraga, Genaël Avis-Huet, Executive Vice President of Europe Operation and member of the Executive Committee at Schneider Electric, and Anne-Laure de Chamard, Group Executive Board Member at Siemens Energy. Thank you, Elima Croft from RBC Capital Markets, for this panel. We are heading to our last fireside chat session, notre dernière conversation au coin du feu, comme on dit en bon canadien. We will discuss powering Europe's competitiveness, energy transition, and the transatlantic dynamic. Please welcome our two guests. Yosu Yone Imaz, CEO of Repsol, and Scott Bryson, Vice Chair at BMO Wealth Management.
Where would one establish a production unit to claim a guarantee of security and quality of one's cosmetics, if not where the strictest controls on the planet are implemented? Where would one feel free to ignite its revolutionary creations, if not where imagination rules and decision makers and observers await them? Confront the most demanding clients to test innovations, if not where customers have forever been so demanding? Where would one look for the most responsible and creative talents, if not where they are born, raised, and educated, in the midst of an environmentally conscious, daring ecosystem? Where would one test one's creation, its texture, its durability, its inclusivity, if not in the historical and forever capital of love, elegance, and wit? Where else?
Good afternoon. Delighted to be here today. My name is Scott Bryson. I'm Vice Chair at BMO. We're a Canadian bank, but we are also North America's 8th largest financial institution. And I'm here today with Senor Imaz, CEO of Repsol, to talk about energy transition in Europe and in the global context. And I'm delighted to be here with him because, in part because he spent 13 years of his life serving the people as an elected politician, as somebody who devoted a significant part of his life to public service. And it sounds a little self-serving for me to say that I have great regard for people like that, because I spent some time in public service in my country, in Canada, as well. And I'm looking forward to your perspective today, Senor Imaz, on energy transition. So welcome.
So, tout d'abord, merci pour m'accueillir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this day.
I spent 1/3 of my life in the midst of my career in the public service, and 2/3 in the private service. So I have both experiences, but it's true that the main part of my career has been developed in the private side.
Yeah, well, there's not a lot of people in government who understand business, and frankly, there's not a lot of people in business who understand government. So I think you're well equipped to bring a lot of value to Repsol, and you've been there 13 years as CEO?
12 and a half years as CEO of the company. I was appointed as CEO of the company after leading the refining, chemical, and later the whole industrial businesses of Repsol. I was appointed in 2014 as CEO of the company.
And that makes you one of the longer serving CEOs of European companies, I would say.
The longest one, probably.
Well, that's, I guess, the experience in big P politics probably helps you in a company as well sometimes.
I don't know, but let me say that politics is a way to manage complexity.
Yes.
I mean, you have a lot of variables you have to manage.
Yeah.
And that could be useful when you are engaged in businesses. And I have to say that, at the very beginning of my career, I'm a scientist. I'm a physical doctor in chemicals. I was a researcher for years. After that, I work in the industrial sector. So, I have, let me say, many different experiences over my professional career.
Well, let's talk about some of the complexities you're dealing with as a CEO of an energy company today in Europe with global reach. The EU elections in 2024, the US election in 2024 mean that we have a new EU Commission and a new US administration coming on board in 2025 with Trump 47. What do you see as the impact on energy transition policy in Europe and in the US? Whether it's on carbon pricing or government subsidies or investment in energy transition. How do you see these changes in terms of the transatlantic relationship?
Well, before jumping into the energy transition, let me say that when I entered in this building this morning, I read a statement that was written by George W. Bush in 1928, saying that in this place, in this building, are the roots of what was the beginning of the European unity. That resulted in what was later the European Union, NATO, and in some way the continuity of the Marshall Plan that this century could be in some way OECD. So, and after reading this statement, I thought that when we are talking about transatlantic cooperation, we are not talking about business. We are not talking about energy. We are talking about values. We share democracy, we share the value of rule of law, the balance of power, human rights. I mean, all that is shared in both sides of the pond. So I think that we have to preserve this relationship. And now we have a new time where we are going to have a new American government and we are going to have a new European Commission. So I think that is really important to start increasing again this cooperation framework between both sides of the pond, because we have the same concern. The same concern we have is China. China that is using in some way the energy transition as a weapon to increase the geopolitical influence they could have in the world, that sometimes, as they did in 2010, used the rare earths and some other critical materials as a weapon with the embargo to Japan, for instance. So we have the same concerns, we have the same value. So I think that we have a strong push and a strong commitment and a strong driver to increase our cooperation. And going to the energy transition, I mean, let me say that 15 years ago, in 2010, Europe account at that time for more or less at 22% of the global GDP, the global economy. It was exactly the same percentage that the US had at that time. 14 years later, Europe, we are now tiny, 17%, and the US, they accounted for 27%. So we are, let me say, doing things in the wrong way. When Draghi analyzed in his report this situation, the conclusion is clear. We need a radical change. And we need a radical change in terms of the energy policy, in terms of energy transition. I mean, an energy policy has to fulfill a trilemma, 3 targets. First of all, the security of supply. Secondly, we need cheap energy, affordability. And third, we have to decarbonize this energy. But in Europe, we forgot the first one and the second one. And we were fully focused on decarbonizing the energy. So the consequence is that we forgot security of supply and we built dependence on Russia. And now we are building a new dependence on China with the critical minerals we need for the energy transition. We forgot the concept of affordability. And for 2 years, European families, they have had difficulties to pay the energy bills at home. Our industry can't pay the energy bill. We have lost, as also is announced in the Draghi report, at 12% of European energy-consuming industry over the last 6 years. I mean, the European industry is becoming smaller and smaller. And you could say, okay, that's positive because we are decarbonizing Europe. That's not true. It's a big lie. We are not decarbonizing the world. We are decarbonizing Europe. But what we are doing is exporting CO2 emissions to some other parts of the world. European industries, they are shutting down. We are exporting industries. We are exporting jobs. And we are exporting CO2 emissions. I'm going to put you an example. The total emissions of Europe today accounts for an 8% worldwide. I mean, we are an 8% of the total emissions in the world. If we take only 2 Chinese sectors, cement and steel, they emit an 8% of the total global emissions. So the same figure than Europe. I mean, every time an European industry is shutting down and we start importing steel from China, as average, this Chinese plant is emitting a 50% more than the emissions we previously had in Europe. And on top of that, we have to add the CO2 emitted in the transport. We took some decisions as deciding, not producing more natural gas in Europe. You could say that is positive because we are decarbonizing Europe. What has had the consequence? The consequence has had that we have started importing LNG from all parts of the world, increasing the LNG price in the world, and making it impossible for the Global South to acquire, to buy the LNG, the gas they need to feed their economy. So they are shifting from gas to coal. If you take the figures in terms of CO2 global emissions from 2022 and 2023, we could see a CO2 increase in the world. The main reason for this emission is the coal burning to produce power. And the main driver for that is the appetite of Europe to acquire the gas all over the world. So we are contributing in a decisive way to increase the CO2 emissions in the world. So we are failing in the 3 targets. We need a more holistic approach to solve this problem, because what we are doing is not effective at all. It's not effective in terms of strategic autonomy. It's not effective in terms of competitiveness of the economy, and it's not reducing the CO2 emissions.
You spoke of affordability, and cost of living issues are creating a lot of political instability as the people, the citizens, are struggling just to feed their families and to keep to house and feed their families and to pay rising energy costs. At the same time, you spoke about economic competitiveness. Jobs are critically important to political stability. The political elite have operated in a bit of an ivory tower around some of these issues. Do you think that the new EU Commission will be sensitive to the realities facing business and families and the challenges they face? Will they be out of touch with those realities?
I mean, I don't know, but they must, because that is happening. And in my opinion, over the last years, we have seen in Europe an energy transition that is driven by ideology. It's not driven by technology. And we have to change radically, as Draghi says in his report, this view. I'm going to put you on examples. We have taken real bad decisions over the last 3-4 years. One of them, to ban the combustion engine by 2035 in Europe. I mean, we had the main industrial sector in Europe is the automotive sector. We have today 2.3 million direct jobs, and almost 13 if we consider direct and indirect in this sector. We are destroying the European automotive sector. You could read news about what is happening with Stellantis in Italy, with Volkswagen in Germany, with Audi in Belgium. And what is the real consequence of this policy on our societies and in terms of emission? I'm going to put you an example, because we are creating a mobility for rich people, because a main part of European society can't afford to buy an electric vehicle. What is happening is that the electric car fleet is, the car fleet is becoming older and older. The Spanish case, for instance, in 2008, the average car fleet in Spain had 8 years. It was 8 years old. Today, the figure is approaching 15 years. What is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that we have not taken advantage of the technologies we have today to reduce CO2 emissions, because we could substitute these cars by new cars, gasoline, either diesel, either electric car. I'm not suspicious. 15 years ago, I put in operation the first electric vehicle recharging company in Spain. But we could use all these technologies, but because we have policies driven by ideology that they are only focused in one technology, we are not taking advantage of this substitution. Another example, we are launching to car makers the message that they are going to be out in 2035. What is the consequence of that? They are not investing anymore in the combustion engine efficiency. So we are losing the opportunity of a decade to reduce our emissions. And saying more, we are not measuring the CO2 emissions, because this electric vehicle is emitting CO2, and it's emitting a lot of CO2. But we are not taking into consideration the emissions in the Chinese mining, in the production of this battery in China, using power produced by coal. And now, if we take the facts, the figures, the maths, a hybrid in Germany, and a small hybrid in Germany, is emitting less CO2, taking into account the German, for instance, power basket than an electric vehicle. But we are taking an ideological approach that is not based on facts, on science.
So the COP agreements are written by people who are very focused on fighting climate change, but they're also can be quite ideological in their perspective, particularly around things like Scope 3 emissions and the way they're measured. In countries like Canada, we don't get behind, for instance, natural gas projects that could be used to displace coal in countries like Germany and help geopolitically vis-a-vis Russia, but also reduce global emissions. But we don't do that because of, we have a cap on our hydrocarbon energy put in by the government, a part of a government that I used to be a minister in. Is there a risk that these COP agreements that, as you said, incent us to, within our own countries, decarbonize, are actually limiting the ability for us to play a bigger role in decarbonizing the world, or potentially using things like natural gas as a transition fuel, as an example? Is the ideologically infused COP framework, should that be rethought and become more practical globally?
First of all, I mean, I have a strong commitment in terms of CO2 reduction. My own company, and I led that process, was 5 years ago the first oil and gas company in the world committing with being net zero by 2050. 35% of our capex year after year is applied in low carbon technologies. We have reduced our carbon intensity index over the last 7 years, including Scope 3, enough 15%. So I have a strong commitment. And because I have this commitment, I'm credible to say that. I mean, we can't afford the oil and gas problem reducing the supply, because the demand is growing year after year. And next year, the demand is going to be higher. And 2 years, in 3 years, it's going to be higher. So the carpet you put here under my seat is produced by oil. This micro has been produced using oil. The cables I'm seeing here, all of them are produced using oil. The parts of an electric vehicle are produced using oil. The blades of the electric wind farms are produced with oil. The solar photovoltaic panels are produced with oil. We are going to need a lot of oil in the world. And even in our world, net zero with no emissions, we are going to need asphalts. We are going to need polymers. We are more energy transition.
Battery minerals.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So if we restrict the supply, what we are going to do is push prices up for the future. So we are going to create a social problem in our society. If we put this kind of problem for gas, we are going to lose the possibility to shift from coal to gas. I mean, if you analyze the figures of the US over the last 15 years, they have performed better than many European countries like Germany, Poland, and some others in terms of CO2 emissions. And the driver of the reduction has been, of course, energy efficiency, renewable power, and shifting from coal to gas. I mean, today, the main emitter in the world in terms of CO2 is the electric production, is power production, because coal is massively used to produce power. So only shifting from coal to gas, we will be able to reduce enough 15% the total CO2 emissions worldwide. So every time you are putting restrictions in Canada to export this gas from Alberta to the Pacific to feed Asia and the growth of these Asian countries, you are contributing in a decisive way to increase the CO2 emissions in the world.
Well, I'm going to take that message back home to Prime Minister Trudeau, who
I know. I think that in Alberta,
sometime today we'll have a new finance minister, we're told. Canadian politics intervening as it sometimes does. U.S. protectionism combined with policies to isolate China economically, combined with China's leadership on the EV side, and I see these billboards around everywhere in Paris for BYD cars, which I'm told are quite affordable and are a pretty good car. 10 years ago, everybody was saying the biggest risk to the world is climate change. Today, we have a government who's saying the biggest risk in the U.S., that the biggest risk in the world is China. How do we reconcile those two if, in fact, the biggest risk is climate change? Should we be balkanizing our efforts to fight it around ideology? China has one form of government and economic management. We have another. You spoke to values. The problem with values-based foreign policy is that we're always implying that our values are better than somebody else's values. But do you think, how do you thread that needle in the U.S. today, which is anti-China and protectionist? How do you thread that needle with fighting climate change if these protectionist and nativist tendencies are balkanizing efforts to actually develop the solutions?
So, but let's go again to the facts. The U.S. is year after year reducing its CO2 emissions with Obama, with Trump, with Biden, and no doubt that they are going to go on reducing emissions with Trump. That is going to happen in coming 4 years. And in the meantime, China is year after year increasing its emissions. So please, China is not a model in terms of coping with the energy transition. They could have, of course, some positive things, but I mean, the US has been able over these years, first of all, to increase their security of supply. Secondly, to have a more competitive industry that we, the Europeans, we have. And let me say that I'm very sad saying that, creating more industrial jobs than in Europe and reducing the CO2 emissions in a dramatic way. And let me say more. I mean, the view that the Americans, they have, the US, because you are also Americans from Canada, the US, they have about the energy transition. First of all, it's a transition that because the commitment with the climate change is a long-term commitment, has to be financed by taxpayers. Here in Europe, I mean, we are putting all this weight on consumers. So we are making a very expensive energy transition that consumers, they can't pay. And here in Europe, we are using the stick to cope with this energy transition, banning A, banning B, banning C. I mean, politicians making decisions about future technologies that are not in their hands. Another principle that is written in stone in the Draghi report, we have to respect the technological neutrality principles. I mean, I spent some years in politics. I was not able to say which technologies they are going to win in 2040, 2045. That is stupid. And we are doing these kind of things here. Politicians are deciding what kind of technologies are going to win. We have to let technologies to compete. I mean, the DeFi, we have the challenge of climate change is very serious. And we need technologies competing, and we need all technologies and more. A lot of them, they are in our hands. Energy efficiency, gas, nuclear, renewable fuels. I mean, not everything is electrification. I mean, 77% of the economy is not electrified. And it's not going to be electrified in coming years. Because in Europe, 5 years ago, the electrification part of the pipe was exactly the 23%, the same that we have now. So we need a broader view. We need more technology. We need less ideology on that.
So along those same themes, you have been direct in your criticism of EU regulatory policy inflexibility and lack of coordination, incoherence in some ways with reality. How do you, as an energy company, develop your long-term plan in an environment of regulatory and policy frameworks that are incoherent, inflexible, and uncoordinated?
It's complex, but we have to do it. I mean, first of all, let me say that we need to push the energy transition. That is not a revolution. It's a transition, and transition means that we are going to need 2-3 decades to decarbonize our society. So our moral responsibility is to go on producing oil. Our moral responsibility is to go on producing gas, because our society, I mean, you used our products to come here to Paris. You don't have any alternative to come here by plane. I mean, all these products I mentioned before, they need the oil production. So we have to do that. But at the same time, we have another moral responsibility. The moral responsibility is to decarbonize the scope 3 of the products we produce. So we have a clear policy of investing in both sides of the system. It's more expensive, it's more complex, and it's not sometimes easy because, I mean, we need investors ready to do that. I'm sure that here there are investors investing in renewable energies, and some of them, they could take companies like Repsol and some others, and they could say, okay, you are great, but we are not going to invest in Repsol because you are producing gas with fracking in the US. I mean, first of all, let me say that fracking saved Europe over the last 2 years. I mean, we have to recognize that fracking saved Europe. And, I mean, but we don't want fracking in Europe. We prefer, I mean, to emit in the US, to add to these emissions the CO2 to transport this gas to Europe and to burn this product in Europe, I mean, emitting more CO2 in the whole system.
Well,
but we have, I mean, and these kind of investors, they are not ready to invest. And we have some other investors that they say, okay, but I'm an investor investing in oil and gas. What are you doing investing at 35% of your capex in these renewable technologies when you have, I mean, models like Chevron, Exxon, they are taking the opportunity. So it's a more complex journey. But we need people ready to invest in the energy transition. Otherwise, we are not going to cope with this problem.
But some of the ideologues in the environmental community don't really confuse themselves with facts around things like fracking. And one could say that they don't know what the frack they're talking about, in a sense, but a couple of you got that, I think. Tough crowd. Look, I think we're over time.
Let me only add a thing, Scott. I mean, without the fracking in North America, we only have 2 alternatives. First, full dependence on Putin, or secondly, to see European families suffering because they can't pay the bill. There is no alternative in the middle today with the current technologies.
And fracking, depending on geology, can be done sustainably, and you know, and it is actually extremely important to energy security. We've seen that in the U.S. In terms of its impact on energy prices for American families. We've seen a lot of Canadian families from all over Canada with jobs in Fort McMurray and other places, but also, you know, and you know, there are companies on the East Coast where I'm from, like Irving Oil as an example. It is really important that we get this right now. We are over time, which is not exactly unsurprising given we have 2 former politicians on the stage, but I got to tell you, I hope you end up back in politics someday. I'd contribute to your campaign if they let me, and if you'd run in Canada, I'd vote for you. I very much adhere to the common sense and directness. I think a lot of politicians today think, and the strategists that from whom they take advice think the people are stupid. And my experience is that you can trust the people, you just have to be prepared to tell them the truth, and they will, in fact, embrace things that are not convenient in the short term if they trust you. And I, even though we've not had a lot of time together, I think you'd earn my trust if you put your name on a ballot again and entered public life. In the interim, you're doing a great job running Repsol in a complex environment, and I wish you and Repsol well. And of course, for any of your banking, investment banking, or capital markets needs anywhere, or particularly North America, I would hope you'd call BMO. Because we're very good at this kind of thing.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much.
I mean, I'm not going to go to politics back. I mean, that was over. But I think that is the moral responsibility of business people to tell their truth and to speak in a clear way. And I think that the challenge we have in our hands in terms of climate change and in terms of decarbonizing the economy is asking for a clear language, saying to our people the truth, in terms that is going to be expensive, and we have to preserve the competitiveness of our industry in this journey. Otherwise, we are not going to have the economic resources we need in Europe to sustain the current society, to create jobs and well-paid jobs for young people. We are going to lose the competitiveness. And on top of that, we are not going to contribute in any way to reduce the CO2 emissions in the world. Simply, we are going to export these emissions to some other places. And emitting in Paris CO2, emitting in Shanghai is exactly the same, because the CO2, I mean, is not a local polluter. So we have to take the holistic approach, and we need a real technological and transparent debate about that. And in Europe, and I mean, I'm saying that, but that is not relevant, my opinion. The Draghi report is very clear about that. We have to rethink the energy transition.
Senor Imaz, we're getting the hook here. I do have one request for you. Next time you're in Canada, can we have a conversation like this where you speak just as clearly and eloquently and honestly about energy transition? Because I think a lot of Canadians would find this candor and common sense quite attractive, and it's a very important message. So would you agree to do that sometime?
I did it some years ago in the conference of Montreal and in Toronto, in these conferences organized by Monsieur Remillard. I'm ready to do it again.
Yeah, but you didn't do it.
Unlawfully.
But you didn't do it with me.
That is an important point. But on top of that, I think that happened 5, 6, 7 years ago, and now we are seeing the consequences of some of our political mistakes in Europe.
And perhaps even a few of them in Canada.
I don't want to enter in Canadian politics, sorry.
Neither do I right now. But thank you. Thank you very much for being...
Thank you, Scott Bryson and Yossou Yon Imaz. For what it's worth, as a European, I would vote for you as well, Yossou. You know, we need someone to implement the Draghi report, right? We've talked a lot about it today. Thank you all. This is the end of our first day at the Conférence de Paris. It was a pleasure to have you here today at the OECD. See you tomorrow at the same place. The meeting time is 9. And I will give you some details about tomorrow morning. We'll meet at 9 for our first discussion, our first session with 2 women. Mary Beth Goodman, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, will be with us, with Valérie Pécresse from Région Île-de-France. We will start with 2 women at 9. We will also be live on IEFA TV, to keep discussing, and we will address our online audience. Tomorrow's theme will be Confronting the Unknown, and the sub-theme will be Artificial Intelligence, Cybersecurity, and Energy. Pendant 2 jours encore un jour demain. On recevra.
So we will have different global leaders from the public and private sector to promote dialogue and collaboration. What we did today, we'll continue to do it tomorrow. Networking is still going on for today. For those of you who want to continue to talk about energy transition and transatlantic dialogue, as we just did, you can move to the participants' lounge.
Out of this room to continue the discussion and some networking. See you tomorrow.